Chapter 75. In the end, Redo and Mano chose to believe Brando's words. For a person to be able to speak so confidently, even if he was lying, he would at least have some confidence and ability. The most important thing was that Brendel had given them a sufficient reason, and that was the reward. Mercenaries and rewards were inseparable, and the reward was like an escape route. It could make all the unreasonable things become reasonable. It did not take much time for more than 10 experienced mercenaries to gather together. They used hand signals to communicate, and horses galloped out from the crowd and gathered together. In a few moments, all of them had arrived. These mercenaries are not simple, they are not ordinary people. Brando thought to himself. However, he still ordered the security cavalry to gather together. He needed to split his men into 2 groups. Although these guys were not very good, it was not impossible to train them. Brando let the horses run around the group once, then he stopped at the side and held his pocket watch, estimating the time. Far away, the refugees who were slowly moving forward in a long line were looking at the group of 20 people, guessing what they were going to do. Many of them joined later and did not know who he was. Instead, they had a deep impression of the female knight who was maintaining order along the line. They kept asking who the girl was, and because of that, Freya's identity rose from the militia captain to the security cavalry captain, and then to a member of the White Mane Swordsman Army or Butchie's security guard captain. All in all, she was at least their leader. All they needed to do was to follow her back. She would naturally lead them out of this place. The slender second hand moved for the last time, and Brando paused the time at this moment. He raised his elven sword and pointed forward. The cavalry immediately moved forward slowly with him. Under his instructions, the riders gathered together and rushed towards the high ground along an ordinary route. What is he doing? If we charge straight up, if the skeleton cavalry does not appear in that direction, wouldn't we look like fools? Mano could not help but ask. If the monsters appear in the other direction and counterattack, the refugees will be dispersed before we can rescue them. That kid does not know how to fight, and you actually believe him. Another person said. Didn't you believe him too? I only did it for the money. That person was startled and immediately retorted. Brando had already ordered the cavalry to speed up. The people and horses moved forward, and there was a rumbling sound on the riverbank. There were still 2 seconds left. Brando estimated the time, and they reached the high ground first. The riders were stunned when they went over the gentle slope. They saw a group of about 40 skeleton cavalry retreating quickly on the other side. This meant that Brando chose the right direction and caught the enemy off guard, and even took the high ground first. Everyone looked at the young man in amazement. How did he judge that? When the riders appeared on the high ground, the skeleton cavalry below them, they began to turn in turn. But Brendel only glanced at the other side, waved his sword twice, and then let his horse lead the way to the front, pointing out a tangent line. He wanted them to charge. But this was not the time to charge at all. It was too impatient. What if the undead turned in a different direction? Moreover, no one knew how fast they could activate. If they were to rush in like this, wouldn't they be giving away their hard-earned advantage? They should observe and test each other. As long as they firmly held the high ground, the first move would always be the first move. Not only the mercenaries, but even the cavalry of the security team looked at Brando. This young man had given them a miraculous advantage at the beginning. This had already given them a little confidence, so at this moment, they were unwilling to give away this advantage. But Brando did not seem to see it. He kept pointing his sword in that direction, which meant only one thing: knights, attack. Then he pulled the reins, turned his horse around, and rode half a circle around his cavalry. Then he took the lead and rushed out. Use your courage, follow me. If you can't catch up with them, then at least drive them below the high ground. Brando shouted. His action of taking the lead seemed to inject a kind of power into the hearts of these people. This kind of power was called confidence. In Erwin's most prosperous era, the knights and nobles were like the flags on the battlefield. Wherever they were, the will of the kingdom would be directed. They were invincible. But for many years, this kingdom could no longer see such a scene. It was as if it could only recall its most glorious era in its twilight years. But even these memories were slowly disintegrating and fading away. But at this moment, there was a figure on the high ground outside of Fortress Reden. It was like a bolt of lightning in the dark, piercing straight down, as if it was the prelude to a new era. The Shire stared at his lord's back. His eyes lit up, and he could not help but put his finger in his mouth and whistled. He urged the warhorse under him to move and galloped down. The two of them rode side by side. Mano pulled out his scimitar as if he had been injected with chicken blood. He looked at the figure in front of him in annoyance. The man and horse moved as one, and their movements were meticulous. No one could find any fault with them. You said he doesn't know how to ride. He didn't know how to ride at first. Then you must have been fooled by him, haha. F***ck your mother's bullshit. An angry voice rang out. The riders raised their weapons and shouted in unison. Then, like a surging flood, they rushed down. At that moment, even the most cowardly of them felt their blood boiling. In the surging flood, the individual strength merged into a huge group. It gave people the illusion that they were omnipotent and invincible. Once the horses moved, they believed that they would win. The young girl picked up the white porcelain teacup again, but the tea was already cold. She held the cup with both hands and listened attentively. When Oberway talked about the knight's charge, her pale silver eyes shone with a mysterious light. After a while, she asked in a daze, they started to charge. Then, as if she was immersed in her own thoughts, she answered her own question, how good is that? It's as if we have returned to our most glorious era. The Knight of Erwin held a bugle and a swallow-tailed flag. Their attendants held a square flag. When the horn is blown, the knights charge forward, and the battlefield is covered with a sea of flags embroidered with the golden coat of arms of Corvado, Grinoires, and Erech. The kingdom is invincible wherever it goes. Oberway coughed. He knew that the princess had ambitions that ordinary members of the royal family did not have. He could not help but sigh. How good would it be if she was a boy? Compared to Ober, the seventh stubborn eldest son and weak youngest son, this princess was more like a wise ruler of a generation. Unfortunately, fate made fools of people. The young girl also realized that she had lost her composure, but she naturally put this matter aside. She asked, and then, did they win? Oberway said, of course, please listen to me one by one. The princess nodded. In the eyes of the mercenaries, the young man's sword was always pointing forward. What was in front of them was a path to a miracle. They began to charge, accelerate, and roll down. The group of skeleton cavalry desperately turned and moved, but their route was completely within Brando's expectations. More than 30 cavalrymen were like a heavy hammer smashing into the frail skeleton formation. Brando waved his hand, and a crescent-shaped wind pressure swept away 4 skeleton soldiers on horseback. The compressed air hit their fragile ribs, and the ribs were dented and broken. Then, the spine was broken, and the whole body flew up and fell down. Crack! 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 A huge hole appeared on the side of the skeleton cavalry. Brando roared and charged forward. The skeleton soldier blocking his way was sent flying with his sword, and he even knocked down another skeleton cavalry with his horse. Then, the experienced mercenaries on both sides of him swarmed forward and tore open the gap with ease. Then, they actually passed through the middle of the undead cavalry scouts. The necromancer in charge only had time to recite the second verse of the spell before he was decapitated by Brando. The necromancer fell from the back of the skeleton horse and turned into a pile of white flames in an instant. Brando led the riders through the skeleton cavalry, and only one of them had a wound on his arm. He led everyone to turn their horses around. At that moment, it was as if he had become one with the leader of the attack in the game. He raised his sword, and every skeleton cavalry that was cut down emitted countless golden light spots. They rose into the air and went straight for Brando. 531 EXP. The skeleton soldiers were the lowest class of soldiers in Madara, but the skeleton cavalry gave more EXP than the ordinary necromancers. Not only were they more powerful, but they were also more agile. It was difficult for ordinary warhorses to catch up with these pure skeletons. After losing the necromancer, the skeletons, which lacked intelligence, began to act on instinct. Their instinct was to destroy living creatures. They gathered together and were ready to charge. But Brando easily commanded the mercenaries to bypass them and regain the high ground. The two sides clashed again. In the end, another skeleton cavalry was stabbed in the thigh. Brando gained another 131 EXP, and then the skeleton cavalry was completely wiped out. Brando ordered his cavalry to stop and rest. Then, he led his men and the Shire to clean up the battlefield. When they saw the scattered skeletons and the skeleton horses that fell to the ground after losing their masters, everyone could hardly believe their eyes. They won just like that, and only 2 of them were injured. But they did not know that Brando's understanding of Madara's skeleton cavalry's tactics was probably deeper than the necromancers who commanded the skeleton cavalry. The young man rode on the horse and stared at the foggy east, pursing his lips. Madara was like an old enemy that he could not defeat in the game, but it was different now. The skeleton cavalry did not have anything valuable. Brando just checked a little, and then asked Gaspard to collect their swords. Madara's onyx sword was one of the better white swords. After all, not every race had the same craftsman, and undead craftsmen had the opportunity to use the flame of the soul to forge steel. Then, he pointed to the distance and said to Reto and Mano, "Listen to the sound." At this time, Mano and Reto looked at Brando in a completely different way. In the previous battle, not only did he prove his ability to command, but his superb swordsmanship and terrifying strength also deeply shocked everyone present. Those skeletons who dared to fight with him all had half of their bones broken and flew out. Even Madara's soul steel was bent and broken by the elven sword. Especially the confidence that this young man possessed. As long as one charged together with him, they would probably be infatuated with the feeling of their blood boiling. Mano and Reto were startled, and immediately listened carefully. But they immediately heard a clattering sound. An army of skeletons, no, a sea of skeletons. To Brando's surprise, it was Reto who spoke first, and his judgment was quite accurate. He looked back and carefully looked at the so-called bar owner. It seemed that the other party's identity was not as simple as it seemed. He had long suspected that these mercenaries had a background. With such strength, they were probably not just ordinary people who worked for the war. Mano's expression also changed. The number of skeletons on the other side of the fog was probably in the thousands. He could not help but look back at Brando. How did this young man know? If he didn't know, then he had chosen the perfect time to attack the undead scouts. It could be said that it was just right. If the undead cavalry was not eliminated, they might really be in a passive situation now. Unless they abandoned the refugees and escaped, but it seemed that neither Brando nor Freya would agree. Should we go up and restrain them? Reynolds' expression darkened and asked. No need. Without the cavalry to restrain them, they can't catch up to us. Brando waved his hand and said, about this matter, it's enough that you know, there's no need to say it. I know Madara's tactical intentions very well, and since you are following me, I am confident that I can bring you out of here, but there's one thing, the battle is unavoidable. Every one of us can die here. The battle will be very fierce, and it won't be a small fight like this one. You better be mentally prepared. Mentally prepared. Mano laughed. We are mercenaries, kid. If we want to talk about this, we are much better than you. Let me tell you one thing, this Redo has experienced the bloody Battle of Binnock Valley. Veteran of the November War. Brando looked at Reynolds and smiled. He sheathed his sword and did not answer. He raised his head and looked at the moon in the east. The moonlight was getting fainter, and dawn was coming. At least before the sun rose, they would not encounter any ghosts tonight. He sighed in relief. P.S. Second update, help me count. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheatyin.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 76. The refugees that followed Brando escaped into the Silver Sparrow Mountains before sunrise. Just as Brando predicted, after they defeated the undead cavalry, the undead army did not chase after them. This was because the low-level undead and vampires' fighting power would be greatly reduced during the day. Brando guessed that they would not let the sea of skeletons advance under the sun before they completely annihilated the white-maned swordsmen. However, after the undead took over a few graveyards in Fortress Reden, their military strength would definitely increase. It was said that when Tarkus arrived at Dragos in the north, his military strength had increased by 100,000, which was 5 times the military strength of the Grenoires region. The number of refugees had increased to 400 to 500 people after they absorbed the undead. The long procession was filled with carriages and loaded mules, and it stretched for half a mile in the Silver Sparrow Mountains. Some of the refugees were looking for their missing family members in the front and back of the procession, and for a moment, the refugees seemed to be livelier. Romaine sneaked out of the carriage in the middle of the day, and was now hugging her precious bag as she sat on a flatbed carriage filled with goods. She was telling a story to a few of the brats. Her story was very unique, and the brats listened with their eyes wide open. Just as she was talking about how Brendel was calm and wise, she suddenly saw a man and a woman riding a horse coming up from behind. She was so frightened that her face changed and she subconsciously lowered her head. Brando slept for about 3 hours, and it was the only time he slept in the past few days. However, because he was worried about Madara's army, he did not sleep well. He quickly realized that the sneaky girl was indeed Roman, and he could not help but laugh and shake his head. "Why did you run out?" "I'm bored." Romaine replied submissively. "It's dangerous outside, Roman." Freya frowned as she looked at her best friend and said worriedly, "If something happens to you, how am I going to explain it to Aunt Jenny?" "There's nothing dangerous about it, I'm telling them a story," Roman said excitedly. The little ghosts hurriedly nodded in unison. "We're not talking about what you're doing now." Freya sighed. "Do you know how nervous I am right now?" Brando looked at the Roman in amusement. "What story are you telling?" "It's a story about Brando." Brendel waved at her, gesturing for her to come over. Romaine paused for a moment, but did not suspect anything. She ran to the edge of the carriage, but was caught by the youth. He pinched her face and pinched it hard as he lectured her. "You have to listen to Freya, and be careful of your own safety, do you understand?" The Roman was shocked and made a whimpering sound. He pushed Brando away in a hurry and raised his eyebrows. Woo-woo. I know. Quick. Let go of me." Then, she quickly retreated to the other corner of the carriage and stared at Brando with vigilance. She patted her chest with a look of lingering fear. Brando smiled to himself. It felt good. But when he turned around, he saw Freya looking at him enviously. The ponytailed girl's face immediately turned red. She turned her head away and said loudly, You're shameless. I don't care about you two anymore." She ran away after saying that, leaving Brando alone in a daze. He didn't know how he provoked the young lady again. While he was in a daze, Mano and Redo came to him. They were looking for him to transfer manpower from the refugees to form a self-defense team. In fact, ever since the refugees entered Silver Sparrow Mountain, the surrounding terrain had become complicated. There were large areas of ABs in the hills, and their vision had become extremely poor. Not only did they have to guard against the possible presence of Madara's undead scouts, but they also had to guard against the bears and maned wolves in the forest. Moreover, the number of refugees was still increasing. Even if Brando threw in more than 30 riders, they probably wouldn't be able to make a splash. Moreover, he also sent out the riders to scout a fan-shaped area in front of them, so the manpower on hand was even more limited. Fortunately, Erwin had a lot of men who had participated in the complete militia training and were brave enough to stand up and fight. Brando had more than 30 onyx longswords that he had just collected from the skeleton riders. He distributed them one by one, and it wasn't a problem to arm 40 or 50 people. Reto and Mano placed these people on both sides and at the back, and let them patrol back and forth, mainly to maintain order and security among the refugees. But this was a simple matter to say, but it was very troublesome to do. They were busy for half the morning for this matter, and Reto was just here to report the results. Mano, on the other hand, had another purpose. He and the Shire sorted out the armor fragments collected from the undead scouts last night and handed them to Brando for inspection. Most of them were broken metal rings, and only a few pieces of metal were left. Brando picked up each piece and looked at it under the sun, then touched the inside of the metal rings with his fingertips. He quickly found the familiar insignia, an eye. Brando put the armor fragments back in Mano's hand and replied, "It seems that the army behind us is the undead maggot's army, just like in history." He suddenly saw Mano looking at him suspiciously, so he quickly coughed and said, "Undead maggot Marcus, he's a half-zombie. Among the military generals of Madara, he's especially good at gathering numbers, but he likes to march at night. When the time comes, you'll see an army of zombies all over the mountains." Reto and Mano looked at each other after hearing Brando's words. They didn't know why Brando knew so much about Madara, but it didn't seem like he was bragging. Besides, this young man didn't have to boast. Since the battle last night, he had already won the hearts of these old mercenaries. But Brando stopped and looked up at the sky. There were a few black spots in the sky to the southeast. He didn't know if they were the hawks in the mountains or the skeletal vultures of Madara. But he soon stopped thinking about it. As the standard scout troop of Madara, skeletal vultures were hard to guard against. They had excellent eyesight, and the necromancers could understand every movement on the battlefield through them. In the last few years of the First Era, between 421, the year of Lin Mao, and 426, the year of astrology, especially the Battle of the Oblique Forest in Cypher, Madara's skeletal vultures were everywhere. The players couldn't get rid of them in time even if they sent out the Wyvern cavalry. That was the peak of Madara's strength, and they were almost at the peak of their strength. However, it wasn't as if they hadn't come up with a solution after years of fighting. For example, in a dense forest like this, the skeletal vultures were severely weakened. Their monotonous coloration made it difficult for them to distinguish the battle environment in the complex terrain. Not to mention Brando's 400 to 500 men, even 1,000 or 2 of them would be like a pebble thrown into the sea. This was the reason why Brendel chose to enter the Silver Sparrow Mountain instead of following the refugees into the Valley of Sharp Rocks, which was easier to traverse. He didn't say it out loud because he was afraid that these experienced mercenaries would have other thoughts. Although he would rather believe that these people were still hot-blooded, he still had to be cautious. Brando thought for a while and continued, "Marcus likes to march at night, but he won't be idle during the day. He will use the elite ghouls and zombies to chase the refugees away, but the first thing he needs to do now is to defeat the White Mane Swordsman. But I don't know where Luke Besson is." In fact, Brando was most afraid of being discovered by the skeletal dragons. He knew that Tarkus had 3 skeletal dragons with him, and it would be a disaster if the skeletal dragons found them in the valley. However, Tarkus should be resting in Fortress Reden for a period of time. After occupying the graveyard, he should use the time to expand his forces. After all, the biggest obstacle had been removed. From Fortress Reden to the Dragos region through the river of sharp stones, there would be no more obstacles in between. Brando couldn't help but look at the direction of the valley as he spoke. At this time, he was already a young general or a rising star in the eyes of Reto and Mano. Even the way they looked at him was a little different. Although they were mercenaries, they didn't have any thoughts of becoming a noble's retainer. But the heavens knew that Brando was just a fake noble. Although the young man purposely corrected the way the Shire addressed him, he still felt a chill down his spine when he heard the latter address him as master in such a serious manner. He might as well just accept the way he addressed him. He thought about it for a while and could only blame it on the factory settings not being set properly. After finishing the morning's work, it was peaceful for the rest of the morning, but the refugees were getting bigger and bigger. Other than a group of refugees that caught up from behind, there were also some refugees that escaped from the valley. They brought news from that direction. Brando was right, Marcus's ghouls and 3 Cabias's skeletons were engaged in a fierce battle with the White Mane army. The outcome of the battle would be decided in the evening. The group of refugees expanded to about 1,000 people. In the middle, Brando asked them to stop and prepare a meal. Fortunately, Madara attacked the northwest and southwest districts when they entered the city yesterday. Most of the refugees had enough time to bring some necessities, so Brando didn't have to worry about food for the time being. But the young man wasn't unprepared. Deer Forest was a natural food storage base in his eyes. There were many different kinds of animals in the forest. Other than the aggressive bears and wolves, there were also wild boars, deer, badgers and rabbits. There were also plenty of pine nuts, mushrooms and wild vegetables in the forest. As long as one had the heart, they could easily feed 1,000 or 2,000 people here. Although they might not be able to live a good life, it was not a problem to ensure that they had enough food and clothing. Around 3 in the afternoon, the riders that were sent out in the front finally brought back the first piece of news. The news wasn't about Madara. Someone wanted to see him. P.S. I finally managed to make it at the last moment. Originally, I was supposed to write this chapter in the afternoon, but who knew that I would be so happy when I returned home on New Year's Day that I would eat a little too much. My stomach would only start hurting at night. Don't overeat. Today's monthly votes are awesome. Thank you for your support. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for the generous rewards led by Blood Cicada and Phaser. I'll try my best to update it, and I'll continue to ask for monthly votes and subscriptions. Chapter 77. Brando met the person that the riders had brought to meet him in the open space between the Abyss forest that was bathed in the afternoon sun. No, it was not just one person, but a group of people. He followed the mercenary who led the way down the mountainside of the Abyss forest. As soon as he walked out of the forest, he saw about 12 haggard people scattered in the open space. 2 or 3 of them had horses, and some of them were bandaged. Most of them were wearing thick leather armor or chainmail, with colorful small round shields and long swords hanging from their belts. They looked like mercenaries like Mano and the others. Their leader was standing not far away with Euhariel. Brando had to admit that it was rare to see such a burly man in the southern part of the Grimoires province. He must be from Erech in the north, or at least had the blood of Erech. The man had a striking reddish-brown beard, a square face, and a sword scar on the corner of his eyebrows. He was wearing a shirt that was open at the chest, and the sleeves were rolled up above his elbows, revealing the muscles underneath. This man must be very confident in his own strength, or else he would not just wear a simple leather shoulder guard without any protective gear. His weapon was a string of hand axes hanging from his belt, which were commonly used by Erech warriors. Not only could it be used in close combat, but it could also be thrown at any time to kill an unprepared person. When the man saw Brando, he respectfully took off his hat and bowed his head. "Honorable Knight, greetings. I'm only here to express my respect on behalf of the Red Jackals. I'm their leader, Badam. Badam in the Erek language meant red, vermilion. Brando further confirmed his origin. He pressed one hand on his sword and nodded subtly. He looked at the man and waited for him to state his intentions. Brando's current identity was a noble knight among the refugees. It was beneficial for him to maintain this identity at this time of the year. Thus, Brando would neither admit nor deny it. Instead, he wanted to show an interesting attitude. This mysterious feeling would help him establish his authority among these people. Brando did not say anything, but Badam was in a dilemma. He carefully asked, "Sir Knight, are you bringing these refugees to escape the pursuit of Madara's army?" Brando looked at him and nodded. "Then, do you still need manpower?" "Why? Do you want to join us?" Brando was startled. He immediately realized that these mercenaries must have retreated from the Valley of Sharp Stones. They were tired and needed someone to provide them protection. If that was the case, the battle between the white-maned swordsman and Maggot Marcus had come to an end. Looking at the situation, Luke Besson should have lost. Brendel raised his head, his gaze piercing through the layers of fir trees in front of him and landed on the undulating mountain range outside. He thought that the retreating refugees and the soldiers of the white-maned swordsman would arrive here soon. If so, the scale of the refugees would increase again. Badam saw the young noble holding the hilt of his sword with one hand and staring in front of him. He could not help but feel uneasy. He quickly nodded and replied, "Yes, Sir Knight. We only need some food, herbs, and rest for a while. We can fight for you again." "What's the situation in front?" Brando suddenly asked. Badam was stunned. "I'm talking about the Valley of Sharp Stones. How many undead soldiers of Madara are there?" "Uncountable, sir. There are large groups of skeleton cavalry. They have been chasing the refugees since night." That bastard Luke Besson did not resist at all. He was chased all the way until he was ambushed by a large group of monsters. His entire army was almost annihilated. Brando was not surprised by Luke Besson's performance. Tiger Luke Besson was indeed one of the strongest generals in the White Mane Army, but he could not escape from the limitations of history. Failure was inevitable. A large group of skeleton cavalry. Did Cabias and Maggot join forces? He suddenly thought of this question, a large group of monsters. What kind of monsters? They are about the same height as humans. Their skin is smooth and their bodies are greenish-black. They have long metal claws and they have a foul smell. They climbed out from the rocks around the valley and attacked us. We were caught off guard, and less than 20% of us survived. Ghouls, but he did not know if there were zombie demons. Brando did not say a word. He was most worried about the ghouls. These undead creatures came from the Black Border. They were one rank higher than the skeleton cavalry in Madara's army. They were one rank lower than the Black Warrior and Pale Knight. However, they were the highest rank in Madara's army in this era. How many ghouls did Maggot Death Marcus have in his hands? 100. 200. Ghouls were level 20 creatures. Every one of them had the strength of an iron-ranked warrior. It was natural for the white-maned swordsman to be defeated by them. "Master Knight." Badam saw that Brando did not say a word and was a little worried. Brando then nodded, "If you want to join my army, you have to follow my rules. I am basically hiring you. Other than the remuneration, I will also give you a place to rest. Follow him and he will give you some food, medicine and bandages. After you have rested, be prepared for battle." As he spoke, he patted the shoulder of the mercenary beside him. "Bring them there." "Thank you for your generosity, Master Knight." Badam quickly bowed deeply. Brando's conditions were far beyond his expectations. He had been to many places, but he had never seen such a generous noble. The rider that followed him asked, "What about you, sir? You can go back first. Let me be alone for a while." Brando looked at the surroundings and felt that it was suitable for his needs. Brando did not want to be alone for a while. He wanted to complete an alchemy. Alchemy was not a mysterious skill in Wonde. Because of the magic civilization, many craftsmen knew a little about alchemy. However, to elevate alchemy to a magical art, it required profound knowledge and long-term accumulation. In the language of the game, alchemy was a skill before and after level 5. Before level 5, alchemy was more like chemistry. Craftsmen used this skill to obtain different materials. After level 5, alchemy became a mysterious art. Wizards used high-grade alchemy to extract pure crystals and magical materials. They could even create magic potions and some natural magical items. When alchemy was combined with forging, crafting, and enchantment skills, it would become the legendary crafting skills of magical equipment. There were many craftsmen and apprentices among the refugees. It was not difficult for Brando to learn alchemy. He only needed to find one of them and ask a few questions to learn basic alchemy. As a noble, no one would suspect that he would secretly learn alchemy. However, Brando wanted to learn alchemy this time. Raising alchemy from level 0 to level 5 required a total of 122 EXP. However, this was not a problem for Brando. After the previous night's battle, he had a total of 967 EXP, which was enough for him to raise his profession level to mercenary level 9. This way, he would have 164 EXP to spare, which was more than enough. It was a pity that alchemy was a mystical skill. Physical professions could only use it under the basic identity of a commoner. This was because the basic identity was different from the profession. Any skills under this identity were regarded as part of the profession. However, since the basic identity could not be raised, a skill under this identity could only be raised to a certain level. For example, a commoner could raise alchemy to level 5, a noble could raise it to level 7, and an alchemist could raise it to level 15. In fact, in the Amber Sword, the combination of identity and profession was a very particular skill. Sometimes, in order to obtain the skills of a wizard, or a wizard to obtain the skills of a warrior, if he did not want to waste his EXP and attributes, he would think of changing his identity. Brando's ideal situation was to raise his alchemy to level 6 and be able to make magic potions. However, at this moment, he could only give up. He waited for Badam and the others to leave with the rider for a while. After confirming that there was no one around, he went to the center of the open space alone. He carefully cleared an open space on the ground, then drew out his sword and drew a simple magic circle in the open space energy conversion magic circle. The knowledge of magic circles came from level 4 alchemy. The craftsman used it to extract the free energy from the substance and convert it into a crystallized state. Then there was the blood refining magic circle. This was why Brando wanted to avoid others. The blood refining technique actually came from Madara's alchemy skills. It was one of the forbidden techniques in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. This was mainly because the blood refining would cause harm to the caster and was not in line with the basic teachings of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. However, the blood refining technique was a very practical technique because it could ignore alchemy equipment and allow the alchemist to complete some simple material synthesis under any circumstances. To be honest, although the Holy Cathedral of Fire strictly prohibited it, Erwin and Cruz did not use this technique in large numbers. Players were only concerned about the effectiveness of the technique. At most, they would only lose a level if they were discovered. Moreover, they would not be discovered usually, right? However, at this moment, Brando was still a little nervous. To the players, losing a level was a matter of losing his head. Although Charles had been keeping a lookout for him, he really didn't dare to challenge the authority of the Holy Cathedral of Fire so blatantly. He took a deep breath and took out the tooth that he had pulled out from the intermediate lich in Fortress Reden and placed it in the center of the magic circle. He then stood up and pricked his finger with the tip of his sword, causing a drop of blood to seep out. He placed his finger flat and let the blood drop in the center of the magic circle. The magic circle flashed red and the tooth immediately turned into a gray crystal the size of a pinky finger. The moment the alchemy circle was completed, Brando felt his heart skip a beat. He had already received -1 damage from the backlash. He wiped the cold sweat off his pale forehead and picked up the crystal. This thing was actually a crystallization of pure soul energy. However, it was different from a soul crystal. If this turbid soul energy was absorbed by someone else, they would probably die from poisoning. Although this thing was crude and small, it was one of the most important items for him tonight. However, he could not relax at this moment because he still had more work to do. 32 teeth, 4 fingers. I'm going to use up my number 5 holy water here. He could only hope that this investment would pay off. However, he had only completed half of it. After about 15 minutes, he heard the Shire's voice outside. Who is it? Brando's heart tightened. He hurriedly flattened the magic circle on the ground and put away all the materials. He then grabbed the Thorn of Light and ran outside. When he reached the edge of the Abyss forest, he saw a middle-aged man standing in front of the Shire. He froze for a moment and realized that this middle-aged man was the one he had saved last night. Why is he here? In Brando's memory, this middle-aged man was quite courageous. He even dared to resist Markov's guards. However, it was a little too unwise. What he didn't expect was that the first thing the middle-aged man said when he saw him was, "Sir, are you using a blood magic circle? Please take care of yourself." This sentence was like a bolt from the blue. Not only Brando, even the Shire was stunned. How did he know? Has he been here for a long time? That's impossible. The Shire didn't believe that he couldn't detect a commoner. The young wizard retainer subconsciously prepared to cast a spell. However, the middle-aged man saw through their doubts and bowed deeply. "Sir, I haven't thanked you for saving me last night. My name is Tamar, an alchemist." Tamar? You're Tamar. Brando felt that the name was familiar at first, but then he remembered that Tamar was Madara's chief alchemist after 380 years, the year of Venus. He was almost stunned by the name. He couldn't help but look at Tamar to see if this was the same Tamar. Tamar wasn't originally from Madara. He must have been turned into an undead during the war. If it was because of that bastard Markov, it wasn't impossible for him to hate this country. The reason for his hatred must be the death of his son. Now that he thought about it, everything made sense. However, what really made Brando confirm was that Tamar was very sensitive to alchemy. Tamar could tell that he was using a forbidden spell just by looking at the backlash. This wasn't something that could be done by an ordinary alchemist. In history, Tamar was a powerhouse that defied the heavens. Most of Madara's high-ranked undead were created by him, Mesat, and Thorlando, the 3 undead alchemists of the past. Tamar's most famous achievement was the black magic circle technology that directly transformed skeletal soldiers from corpses. This technology could be said to have directly doubled the military strength of Madara. Now, it seemed that it would be a little difficult for Madara to achieve this result. Brando looked at Tamar, who was still a human in front of him, and couldn't help but smile a little. "Sir." His smile startled Tamar. Could it be that this Sir Knight actually had some sort of special fetish? He had heard of the dirty rumors between the nobles, so even if he was almost 40 years old, he couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. The Shire coughed, and only then did Brando wake up. He hurriedly explained, "You're that master alchemist from Fortress Reden, Tamar." Master alchemist? That was one of the top titles in the field of alchemy. Was he that famous? Tamar was stunned and quickly shook his head. "I'm just an unknown alchemist. Sir, I've been working for the noble parliament, but I didn't have much success, not famous. I've picked up a treasure." Brendel was overjoyed. P.S. Today's monthly votes are not good. Students, please support me. It's a little painful to look at. Look at how hard I'm working to update, please support me. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters, support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 78. On the way back to the refugees, Brando found out that Tamar had been looking for him ever since he woke up from his coma in order to thank him for saving his life last night. At that time, he saw Brando, the Shire and the horsemen leaving the refugees together. He followed them all the way and did not expect to coincidentally bump into Brando casting the forbidden spell. However, Brando was not worried that Tamar would turn around and report him to the Holy Cathedral of Fire. On one hand, he felt that this tough middle-aged man was not that kind of person. On the other hand, Tamar did not have any evidence. What Brando did not know was that while he was surprised by Tamar's identity, Tamar also felt that he was mysterious. The middle-aged man had only seen the description of the blood magic circle in some parchment books. In fact, even he did not know how to cast this forbidden spell. At that time, he only inferred that Brando was using the blood magic circle based on the possible effects of the blood magic circle on his body. But he had to admit that even so, he guessed correctly. This kind of sensitivity and talent was not something that ordinary people could have. However, Tamar did not have any prejudice against the forbidden spell itself. In this day and age, which nobles did not violate it. The Holy Cathedral of Fire also strictly prohibited the trafficking and smuggling of slaves. But in the border areas, this dirty business was prosperous, and even some of the clergy were involved in it. In comparison, he now wanted to discuss with this young noble about his alchemy skills. The middle-aged man thought for a while and then asked, "My lord, what do you want to make?" Brando could not help but feel a little proud when he thought of the future master alchemist calling him "my lord." "I need to synthesize a batch of spirit crystals. The materials are the remains of high-level undead. I want to use them to make a spirit statue." In fact, what he wanted to make was a spirit statue, white deer. This was a relatively simple spirit statue. It could summon the spirit of a white stag. In the ancient legends of Wonde, the white stag lived in an ancient oak forest. The quiet sun shone on the island in the middle of the forest, symbolizing the resting place of the soul. Therefore, the white stag was very sensitive to spirits. Brando wanted to use it to sniff out the ghosts hidden in the spirit world. That was probably the first type of mid-ranked undead that they were about to encounter. They were the scariest assassins and spies of the necromancers in the night. Soul statue. Tamar couldn't help but feel a bit incredulous. The soul sculpture was just a simple alchemy product. The only difficulty was the difficulty of obtaining the materials. The middle-aged alchemist found it hard to imagine that Brando would use a forbidden technique to create a soul sculpture. "Mr. Tamar, you don't have to be confused. It's actually because we lack alchemy tools." Brando saw through Tamar's doubts and answered. Tamar almost fell to the ground when he heard this. The blood refining technique was very powerful in the records. One of the main reasons why it was called a forbidden technique was because it could be used quickly and simply on the battlefield. It had an advantage that ordinary alchemy could not compare to. However, the backlash from activating a high-grade array using the blood-refining art was also frightening. In the past, in the war between the Light faction and the Dark Kingdom, there were alchemists who used the blood-refining art to summon powerful creatures to turn the tide. However, the core of the technique was the sacrifice, which was completely contrary to the teachings of the Light faction. Therefore, it was listed as a forbidden technique. But now, this young nobleman actually used it as a substitute for alchemy tools. Then again, a professional alchemist would carry his tools with him even if he lost his life. "Well, my lord. Actually, I also have some tools with me. If you don't mind, you can use mine. The blood refining art is a forbidden technique that is very harmful to the body. It's better not to use it. Tamar finally reacted after a long while. Of course, I don't mind. Then, I'll have to trouble you. Brando, of course, would not be stupid enough to bleed himself. Although the number 5 holy water was not as powerful as the number 7 holy water, it was still a precious potion that could save a life at a critical moment. Brando was in a good mood because he could reduce the cost of alchemy and unexpectedly obtain a future master alchemist. For the first time in days, he felt relieved. This allowed him to walk with the Shire and Tamar while discussing alchemy techniques. The Shire was an apprentice wizard. Although he had not really mastered alchemy, the Highland wizard mentors in Karsuk's Black Tower were all master alchemists. He was very familiar with alchemy, so his knowledge was extraordinary. Brando, on the other hand, had level 5 alchemy knowledge. Even if he participated in Erwin's official alchemy exam, he could easily get the title of level 1 professional alchemist. Compared to Tamar, who was still wandering around the door, Brando was more like an alchemy genius. Tamar benefited a lot from the discussion, but the middle-aged man's wild ideas also made Brando nervous. He knew that Tamar lacked the opportunity and external environment. Otherwise, he would one day become a legendary master alchemist. After all, alchemy was a skill that required a lot of resources. The teeth of the mid-level liches that Brendel used before were sold for more than 300 tor in the black market or the wizard market. 30 of them were enough to make a simple statue of a white deer. While the 3 of them were discussing, Brando saw Freya walking along the long line of refugees. She looked drowsy. What's going on? Brando was stunned. He walked over and waved his hand in front of Freya's face. There was no response, so he patted Freya's head. Freya was startled and woke up abruptly. What are you doing? She saw that it was Brando and could not help but gnash her teeth. Brando! Where have you been? There are so many people coming. I can't handle it. Her voice was getting softer and softer. It did not sound like she was complaining, but more like she was wronged. Brando asked her to lead the refugees, and she did her best. However, as the number of refugees increased, she felt exhausted. In fact, just like Brando, she had not slept for the past few days. Compared to Brando, she was under a lot more pressure. The Shire and Tamar saw that Brando and Freya were talking, so they tacitly took a step back and continued their discussion. As for what happened between the young man and the girl with a long ponytail, they pretended that they did not see it. As the saying goes, the onlooker sees the clearer picture. Brando was completely unaware of Freya's special dependence on him. The young wizard squire, on the other hand, had the intention to watch a good show. As for Tamar, the honest middle-aged alchemist thought that the girl was the young noble's fiancée. You haven't slept yet. There are so many people, how can I have time? Brando, did you know that the white maned swordsmen were defeated? We just received a lot of soldiers who retreated from the Valley of Sharp Stones. I heard that many of them died. Freya rubbed her eyes that were as red as a rabbit's and said with some dissatisfaction. Brendel was taken aback. This silly girl can't be doing everything by herself, right? He could not help but touch his forehead. Don't tell me you want to do everything by yourself. Then what should I do? Freya stared at him blankly. Don't you still have Reto, Uncle Mano, and the others? If you really can't do it, you can just pick a few people from the refugees and give them the power to help you. Brando felt that the ponytailed girl was too stubborn. Why didn't you say so earlier? Brando knocked on her forehead. It has nothing to do with me, it's because you're too stupid. Freya's face turned red, and she pushed his hand away. I'll talk to you later. She turned around and ran away as if she was on fire, leaving only a hasty back view. Brando shook his head and laughed when he saw the ponytail bobbing up and down. How was it? The Shire chuckled as soon as Freya left. Brando picked up the water skin and was stunned. What do you mean by how was it? Freya, she's a good girl. She's kind, serious and cute. Can't you see, my lord, she actually likes you? The young mage replied. Brendel had just gulped down a mouthful of water, and he could not help but spit it out. What did you say? I said, Miss Roman and Miss Freya, this is big trouble, my lord. Brando spent the whole afternoon carving a suitable container. After all, it was his first alchemy work. At first, Brando wanted to complete the base of the white stag by himself. But after cutting a few pieces of ABs, he soon found the gap between dreams and reality. The best product in his hand looked more like a carrot than a stag. He had no choice but to entrust this job to Tamar. Most professional alchemists should be good at crafting, tailoring, painting and even forging skills. Of course, Brando was an exception. When he got out of the carriage, it was almost evening. The sun was gradually sinking below the rolling mountains in the west. The afterglow of the setting sun plated the mountains with a beautiful bronze color. In the distance, the tip of the forest of ABs sparkled as if it was dyed with gold. Brando held the carriage with one hand and looked at the sunset. He could not help but think that if he kept going in that direction, he would eventually come across a mountain that reached into the clouds, the Kalanga Mountains. The majestic mountain continued to meander westward, forming a peninsula in the Dead Moon Inland Sea. He remembered that his first expedition in the game had been through that forest, and they had finally reached the eastern shore of the Dead Moon Inland Sea. This was the world, it was so real in front of his eyes. After leaving the carriage, Brando spent some time looking for the Roman, but he could not find the future Romaine. In fact, Romaine was on her own adventure during the day. Most of the time, you could not see her. He looked at the sky for the last time, and it was starting to get dark. At around 7:30, Brendel ordered the refugees to stop at a deep ravine in the valley. The light here was even dimmer, and the shadows on both sides of the ravine made it difficult to see what was hidden in the shadows. When the mountain started to fog, it was accompanied by the sound of night owls in the distance. It was very creepy. But Brando knew that this was the only place where they could avoid the vision of Madara's skeletal vultures. When the night came, it would be the time for the ghosts to appear. After settling the refugees, Brando ordered the militia to cut down trees on the nearby mountain. He wanted them to make a batch of simple spears in a short time to replenish the new manpower. His core strength was still the public order cavalry, Mano, and the others. Now, it had expanded to more than 50 people. Since the beginning of the day, he had received close to 100 mercenaries and white Main Lightfoot men. In addition to the militia recruited from the refugees, this number could be doubled. Therefore, he did not lack manpower. What he lacked was weapons. The militia still had to share a sword with 3 people. This reminded him of the revolutionary ancestors in his world. On the other side, Brando ordered the Shire to gather the leaders under him. For example, Reto, Mano, Gasliel, and the newly joined Badam. These people represented the small circles under him. He had to explain the plan to them tonight to prevent any mishaps. At 8:00, the last ray of light disappeared into the horizon. The 12 stars of the Witch King's constellation were the first to appear in the eastern sky. Brando and the others stood at the top of the valley. He looked down at the refugees who were busy setting up camp and said, "You have seen the situation today. The White Mane Army and most of the refugees met with misfortune in the Valley of Sharp Rocks. I'm sure most of you have heard about it. Madara's tactic is not to chase us away. Instead, they want to kill us so that the news of the fall of Fortress Reden will not reach Vermeer. Then what should we do, my lord? At this time, the undead army has far outnumbered us. Our riders said that they saw a sea of skeletons in the west. They move slowly during the day, but when night falls, they are everywhere. Mano raised his head and asked. And zombies, another person added. Of course there's a way, but it's impossible to escape. Due to Luke Besson's failure, most of the death maggots and Cabias's elites are already in front of us. We need to find a shortcut from the other side. Brando replied. So, have you heard of the remains of the saint? Everyone was stunned. PS equals ___ equals monthly votes dropped to third place, and it seemed that it was still slipping towards fourth place unstoppably. Students, please support me. My heart is bleeding as I look at my ranking dropping. But why do I feel so much colder today? My hands and feet are almost numb from the cold. Chapter 79. The Remains of the Saint. Legend has it that during the era of the sages, the ancestors opened up a sanctuary in the valley. There were statues of ancient kings at the entrance of the valley, and any dark creatures that tried to enter would be struck by lightning. Even the power of darkness within a 1-kilometer radius of the valley would be suppressed to a minimum. Then, during the Dark Era, the humans, elves, and dwarves came out of the sanctuary and defeated the Twilight Dragon, Calamity, under the leadership of the Azure Knight. Only then did the Year of Chaos begin. It is the remains of the saint, the guardian valley of the kings, Your Highness. Oberway replied. He can find such a place. The princess had already changed her cup of tea, but she did not pay much attention to it. Even the white porcelain teacup with golden edges that she liked was ignored. She only used her slender fingers to fiddle with the silver spoon. That young man should have known about it beforehand, but he did not know the general location. Oberway replied. But his method of finding the way is quite ingenious. Your Highness should have heard that the Witch Queen of Bunasan inherited the power of fate and the stars from generation to generation. There is also a faction of great wizards in the Tower Council who believe that the power of the stars and fate exists, and it came from the blind goddess Elaine. I thought that was a story that only existed in myths. Not necessarily. Can I continue to listen? But Your Highness, your court teacher, Sir Panasan, should be waiting for you. The princess smiled and said slyly, We are already late, Sir Oberway. So please continue, I want to hear how they spend the night. Oberway smiled as he had already expected this, so he continued, Then our story will start from a legend, a story about a king and a white stag. The sky was completely dark, and the wind swept through the layers of clouds, causing the Abyss forest to rustle like the waves of the sea. Freya looked at the dark sky with a worried expression, and the wind blew her hair into a mess. The girl held her best friend's hand and could not help but whisper, Is Brando really that confident? Even Leto, Uncle Mano, and the rest of the locals have never heard of such a place. Don't worry, Brando is the best. Romaine looked at the stars behind the clouds and answered matter-of-factly. You didn't even think about it, did you? I didn't need it in the first place. Freya couldn't help but feel angry when she talked to this woman whose mind was blank. Only then did she realize that her nervousness seemed to have lessened a lot. She couldn't help but think that the Roman and Brando seemed to have some similar qualities that made people feel at ease. But Brando was calm and confident, and the Roman was carefree. The ponytailed girl suddenly felt that she didn't know what she would do if she didn't have them by her side. But it was at this time that the refugees suddenly exclaimed. Freya and the Roman turned their heads together, and they couldn't believe that a breathtakingly beautiful creature had suddenly appeared in the middle of the camp. It was a completely transparent white stag. Its body showed the most perfect proportions of such an elegant and noble creature. Its limbs were slender, its body was strong, and the long horns on its head were as sharp as swords. It didn't seem to be a creature that should exist in this world. It jumped up and stood on a rock, and its body was surrounded by light spots that fluttered up and down like fireflies. It wasn't just them, even Reto, Mano, and Badam stood up at this moment. Brando was further away, holding the stag's pedestal in his hand. He stood together with the alchemist Tamar and watched the stag jump up the rock in a few leaps, nodded at them, and ran away. The finished product is a little flawed, but after all, the conditions are limited. It's already very difficult to achieve this step, Brando said. He was very satisfied with his first alchemy product. The Shire and Tamar expressed the same opinion, but the young wizard still asked, "My lord, do you think that the Valley of the King's Guardian is real? You know that thing?" Brando was stunned. Of course, ancient knowledge is a compulsory course for wizards. Many schools of magic originated from the era of the sage. I can guarantee its authenticity, but the valley is in the fog, and its location is uncertain. I can only hope that Goddess Helene can help me tonight, so that my precious stag can find the way faster. Brando thought that of course, the place where the remains of the sage was also very famous in the game. Countless people had been there, and many more people speculated that there might be a huge secret hidden in it. But no one had ever found anything from it. He had also been there, but he only found the same thing as others. That was, he didn't find anything. Help? Tamar asked. It depends on whether Goddess Helene cares for us or not. Brando replied. What will happen if she doesn't? The Shire turned his head. Brando didn't answer this time. There were at least 3,000 to 6,000 skeletons and zombies following behind them. In front of them were the elite troops of death maggots and cabias, as well as the wandering ghosts in the forest. This night might not be easy. Brando saw the white stag in front of him, causing the refugees to cheer and then stop at the other side of the valley. He knew that tonight's adventure had begun. He looked at the time. It was 11 o'clock. So he ordered the refugees to break camp and advance. The guards with spears in their hands moved in parallel with the refugees. 2 long black dragons walked along the valley. There was also the light of the moon and the stars, so there was no need for torches. The last 50 riders were the ones who brought up the rear. Brendel and Seal leapt onto their horses and pulled out their swords. The Thorn of Light's blade was glowing with a faint light, indicating that there were no undead nearby. Let them follow the white stag, it will bring us luck. Brando held the sword in his hand and turned his horse to his knight. Mano rode his horse and followed behind him. He asked loudly, "My lord, can we really pass through that valley and be in front of Madara's army?" "Of course. I'm not doubting you, my lord, but this sounds a little unbelievable." "Indeed, but you just have to trust me at this time. I won't joke with my life. What about the undead army in front of us?" From here to the north, there are at least 3 columns of Madara's army lingering in the mountains. Some of them came from the Valley of Sharp Stones, and some came from the Hunting Deer Forest. I suspect that they are the advance troops of the White Knight and the ghouls. One of the white maned swordsmen asked. Brando recognized him. Luke Besson called him Terran. He had fought with him once in Fortress Reden, and he remembered that he used his sword to send him flying. Of course, he might have remembered wrongly, or it might have been 2 other people. The situation back then was too chaotic. And this officer seemed to have a deep prejudice against him. Although he was convinced by his swordsmanship, he still had to stand out and oppose him when it came to tactics. Moreover, we have Maggot Marcus chasing after us. The officer continued, "If we fight them head-on, we will be dead." Brando looked at him. He indeed needed an officer from the white maned swordsmen to restrain his soldiers, so he was not angry. He only replied, "They will always have a loophole." "What loophole?" Terran held the reins and asked. Brando obviously would not reveal the secret of the gargoyle to him. Although some of them knew that he had the right to control the gargoyle, they did not know what he could do with it. "We will go behind the maggot, and they will pass through here in half an hour." He thought for a while and said on a whim. Everyone went silent. Even the mercenaries who were beginning to trust him couldn't help but wonder if this guy was crazy. But Redo said, "That's a good idea, if we can grasp the opportunity." Brendel turned around to look at the man in surprise. This was not an ordinary act of bravery. He had only done this once in the game. Sneaking through the gaps in the enemy's defense line, destroying one or two squadrons, and then sneaking behind another squadron. It was not impossible to do this, but it required a great deal of control over the situation, and also to be able to stop the enemy's eyes. Even if Brando was confident, it was just a casual remark. He did not expect Redo to see the opportunity and even dare to risk it all. Everyone was stunned again. But this time, it was Mano's turn to speak. He finally reacted and said, "Okay, if that's the case, I'll take the risk too. But to lead 1,000 or 2,000 refugees to pass through the enemy's defense line." Other than Mano, Redo, and Brando, everyone else, including Freya, thought that the three of them were crazy. But Brando was very calm. He looked at the gargoyle in the sky and knew what he was relying on the most. Marcus knew that there was another group of refugees in the direction of Silver Sparrow Mountain since this morning. They had escaped before dawn and even killed a group of skeleton knights. But at first, he did not pay much attention to them. After all, most of the refugees escaped into the deer hunting hills in scattered groups. Compared to the group of refugees who were with the white-maned swordsman in the Valley of Sharp Stones, they were the core of his and Kabia's operation. Humans were really weak. To him, the battle was as easy as he expected. The white-maned army was known as Erwin's regular army, but they were also weak in front of Madara's army. After chasing them for the entire day and delivering the final blow, the battle ended before sunset. Although the vanguard suffered heavy casualties, they were only cannon fodder. The ghouls and Kabia's skeleton cavalry did not suffer any losses. Compared to that, the battle last night hurt him the most. It would take a long time for more than 40 skeleton cavalry to accumulate. Marcus then turned his attention to the group of refugees. Lord Tarkus had ordered them to seal off the Valley of Sharp Stones. Every troop that participated in the battle did not dare to be careless. However, he immediately sensed an unusual aura. The enemy seemed to be very good at evading the detection of the skeleton vultures. Throughout the day, they only caught sight of the group a few times, but in the end, they still lost sight of them. This was not a good sign. Under the dim flame of the soul, Marcus spread out the sheepskin map and drew a few circles around the Silver Sparrow Mountain. Author's note: I did not disappoint. But what about everyone's votes? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 80. After the refugees left the valley, they headed east. Without a fire, the long line of refugees was immersed in darkness as they moved forward. Occasionally, the group would meander through the mountain stream. Looking at the dark peak of the mountain, it was the tip of the Abyss. If it were not for the stars, it would be difficult for anyone to identify the direction in such an environment. The people at the back could only passively follow the group in front, one after another. The entire group was made up of ordinary citizens. Although they were more conscious due to fear, it was inevitable that they would make a ringing sound as they moved forward. Under Brando's instructions, Freya divided the refugees into a few areas, and each area had 2 core members who were responsible for maintaining order. Freya told the citizens what to do, and Brando told them what to do if they did not do so. This was the only way to restrain the entire group. However, the experienced captains were not too worried. Redo and Mano had rich battle experience, and they told Brando that the sound would not travel too far in the dense forest. At most, it would be like a whisper from an arrow's distance. On the other hand, the white-maned swordsman's dragon-subduing tower was listening to the wind. The rustling of the trees had long suppressed all other sounds, and Brando's hearing was not as effective as his sight in such an environment. Brando listened to the sound of the wind from afar. It sounded like the rustling of pine trees, or the chirping of birds in the Abyss forest. But when he listened carefully, there was a different feeling. It was light and long, as if a group of strange instruments were playing in the mountain wind. It also sounded like a mysterious whisper, as if an unknown existence in the forest was telling the world something. In grimoires, and even in the entire southern region of Erewhon, people described the whispers in the forest as the witches' bewitching whispers. It was said that many people never returned from the forest because they fell into the witches' trap. Of course, these legends were not credible, but at this moment, there was a strange sense of mystery. Brando led the horse and walked at the side of the group. The other mercenaries followed behind him. Because everyone only had one horse, the riders tried their best to conserve the stamina of their horses in preparation for any possible battle. Although the war horses in this world were abnormally strong and had about 20% more stamina than the average horse, in fact, the cavalry rarely used horses as mounts. This was because in the war here, they were too weak. They had already deviated from the valley by about 10 miles to the east. In fact, they had already left the range of Silver Sparrow Mountain. This was not like a highly developed society where even the tiniest mountain had a code name. For example, Brando did not know what this mountain should be called. It was supposed to be part of the southeastern extension of the Stag's Hills, but it was off the main road, and was uninhabited. It was only in the hunting season that the hunters passed through it, and their cottages could sometimes be seen in the hills. Brendel had already released the gargoyle and had it move towards the southwest direction. At the same time, the cavalry scouts also retraced their steps. About half an hour later, the news came back. The two seasoned mercenaries were pale when they saw Brando. They found skeletons half the distance between them and the mountains. Brando could imagine the scene, when you saw a sea of grayish-white, creepy skeletons slowly appear from the top of the mountain, then slowly spread over the forest, and then poured down the mountain, leaving only the sound of wah-wah in the mountains. It was really shocking. So, while he gently comforted the two mercenaries to rest, he also told the others about the weakness of the skeletons so that they would not lose their fighting spirit because of the approaching danger. He also sent out scouts to the northwest. Brando knew Madara's habitual arrangement at this time of the year. It was progressive, and not only could it be mobilized flexibly, but the range of the scouts' control was also very large, and they could provide support from the front and back. This tactic was designed to make full use of the advantage of Madara's undead army. In fact, in the early days of the War of the Black Rose, the Dark Lords once carried this tactic forward with excellent mid-level and low-level commanders. But it had a fatal flaw. That was the eyes. Once the support of the ghosts was lost, there would be a huge gap between the squadrons, especially in such a mountainous area, where it was easy for the enemy to cut through. And another weakness was that if the commander was too weak, this arrangement could easily play the classic adding fuel to the fire situation. Of course, the reason why Madara dared to use this arrangement before the Second War of the Black Rose was that they were confident in themselves. They had too many outstanding talents at their disposal in this era. On the other hand, there were not many ways to detect ghosts in this era. It was just that Brando happened to know one. He could not help but look up at the hillside. Mano led the militia through the forest of Abyss. The seasoned mercenary kept looking back at the beautiful white stag in the valley below. Brando told him that the stag would show them where the terrible undead were hiding. Mano had his doubts. If he wanted to fight, he had to follow the rules and not be as secretive as the wizards. Just like at this moment, they had already left the group of refugees far behind them, almost a mile away, but that beast still didn't react at all. But just as he was about to curse, he saw the elegant creature suddenly turn its head in a direction and put its hooves on the ground, showing an anxious look. Over there. Mano immediately pointed his curved sword forward and ordered the others to quickly rush over. In that direction was the forest of Abes, which was no different from other places. But just as they were about to flank it, a faint light emerged from the forest, like a pale shadow, and then gradually formed a halo of light in the shape of a human floating in the air. "Isn't that a ghost, Martha above?" It was not only the militia behind him, but even Mano himself stopped in his tracks. But the pale figure had already let out a shrill scream and pounced on the militia with bared fangs. The ferocious scream made everyone's heart turn cold, but it also made the forest quiet down. Mano felt that he had never fought such a strange battle in his life. For a moment, the face of the ghost looked like many of his comrades who had passed away, but he quickly shook his head and threw the thought out of his mind. Brando had warned him that all of this was an illusion, and he must not let it take advantage of him. He did not dare to doubt the young man at all. The scene in front of him was too strange. Mano tightened his grip on the curved sword in his hand. The bright blade swung out, and the blade went through the ghost's body, but a layer of ice immediately formed on it. Mano knew it was not good. There was no physical impact, which meant that his attack had missed. The ghost was between a spirit body and a physical body, so physical attacks had a 50% chance of missing. Mano did not have time to make any big movements to dodge. The pale fingers of the ghost had already reached for his face. He tilted his head at the critical moment and let the slender fingers pass through his shoulder. The veteran mercenary immediately felt a piercing cold on his shoulder, as if he had lost all feeling in his left arm. "Attack, you bastards!" He took the opportunity to fall to the right, and then shouted at the stunned militia. Only then did the townsfolk react. They raised their spears and stabbed at the spirit. 3 spears directly pierced through the faintly discernible shadow, but the other 2 spears held the ghost up, causing it to let out a shrill cry. Manua took advantage of the situation to jump up from the ground and stabbed at the pale figure. This time, he was lucky. The sword hit the ghost's soul. The strength of a black iron swordsman burst out in an instant, and the ghost screamed and disappeared. Everyone was relieved. They could not help but sit on the ground weakly. No one said a word. In fact, even Mano, the veteran mercenary, was a little worried. But at that moment, there was only one thought in his mind: how did the young man know all this? The young man looked away. Mano and Badam did a good job. He could not help but feel lucky that he had these veteran mercenaries under him. Otherwise, it would be troublesome for him to deal with these mid-level undead. However, the soul statue, White Deer, was actually a very common exorcism item, but it required a certain amount of imagination to relate it to military affairs. Brando could not help but look back at Freya. This method was actually invented by the goddess of war. Did he plagiarize? But in any case, Madara had lost these ghosts as their eyes, and they must be feeling uncomfortable tonight. Perhaps the necromancers who controlled them would soon find that the ghosts they sent out had all disappeared in a certain direction, but this did not mean anything. They still needed to verify and wait for news again. 1 or 2 hours was enough for him to do a lot of things. The gargoyle continued to fly to the southwest. Brando finally saw a skeleton cavalry passing through the forest. He did not know if he had missed anything before, but he guessed that this should be the front line of a column of scouts. Thus, 3 minutes later, he found another group of skeleton cavalry. At the same time, Madara's tactics during this period coincided with what he had imagined. He let the gargoyle cross a few mountain streams tangential to the ridge, and soon he saw an army of black skeleton soldiers in the valley. There were about 200 of them, a squadron. The gargoyle continued to move forward along the valley, exactly as he had imagined. Brando immediately found another 2 squadrons. Although he could not see which column they belonged to, the commanders of Madara's columns in this period were not to be trifled with. He thought that the White Knight, Ebden and Weezer should not be so far behind, but it should be either Diren, Gilob, or the Blood Wizard Gladios. 2 main generals, 5 columns, and a scale of nearly 10,000 undead, concentrated in the hills that were only 20 to 30 miles wide. The undead army began to move in large numbers under the night sky. Time was running out. Brando still wanted to see how deep the area between the second and third layer of Madara was, and where the other column was, but the gargoyle had already reached its maximum flying range. Of course, although he had previously lied to Martin and Breton that the gargoyle had scouted the entire Butchie region in a day, the truth was that the gargoyle was not omnipotent. 1:05 a.m. News came from the northwest. Just as Terran had predicted, a large number of zombies had appeared in that direction. The elite troops of the Death Maggot had indeed arrived from the Valley of Sharp Rocks. When the news spread among the mercenaries, everyone's face was solemn. They had a glimmer of hope, but they did not expect the situation to develop towards the worst. As a result, the group of refugees was surrounded. Of course, unless they could speed up and break out of the encirclement before it closed in on them. But the mercenaries looked at the refugees, then looked at Freya and Brando, and knew that this was not possible. For a moment, everyone was silent. Freya nervously grabbed the reins and subconsciously looked at Brando. Only Brando took a look at his pocket watch and then mounted his horse, as if he did not care about the atmosphere around him. He pulled out his sword and said to the mercenaries, "Listen up, everyone." The young man's voice was sonorous and powerful. "There are 2 squadrons southwest of us, 2 to 3 miles away from us, and another squadron further away. There are 4 undead cavalry scouts coming from those directions. What I want to tell you is that we need to kill 2 of them, and attack one of the squadrons to open up an opening. We also need to go behind the Death Maggot, just as we planned. We have 2 hours to complete all of this. After 2 hours, we will start playing hide-and-seek with the undead army of Madara." Brando raised his sword and pulled the reins to make the horse turn in front of everyone with a mocking expression. "What, are you afraid?" There was a complete silence. At this moment, everyone was stunned. How did this young man know all of this? He could not be speaking without thinking, right? But although Brando surprised everyone every time, most of them knew that he never spoke without thinking. Especially when he stood upright on his horse and raised his sword to point to the southwest. Every word he said was spoken with certainty, just like when he led them to charge in the first place. It was as if the direction his sword pointed was the path to a miracle. No matter how difficult and dangerous it was, it would eventually open up a path. It was a path of blood left behind after the thorns parted. Brando looked at these people without saying a word, just like when he led those like-minded people to charge into Madara. Someone once said that he was the most qualified leader of the attack because once he made a decision, he would press forward. No one spoke. But all the mercenaries got on their horses, and there was a sound of metal scraping. Everything is for victory. Long live Erwin. Author's note, today's first update. Seeing a friend in the book review section saying that they want to exchange their tickets for updates, I feel a little sad. I've always felt that the number of votes should be more than the number of votes. That way, everyone's relationship wouldn't be like friends anymore. It would become a naked transaction. I feel a little uncomfortable. Speaking of the issue of updating, everyone can see how hard I work. I don't have a stockpile of manuscripts, and I'm doing my best to write every day. Especially for the explosiveness of the past few days, I've squeezed out almost all of my free time. That's all. Don't mind it, everyone. Just treat it as if I'm talking nonsense. Chapter 81. When Brendel led the light cavalry through the forest and pointed out the undead scouts that were groping their way through the valley, everyone was stunned. It was as if their fantasy had become reality. The young man who led them had the ability to foresee the future. Only Leto and Taryn guessed that it was the gargoyle, but they did not have much time to think about it. Brendel had already given the order to attack. More than 50 riders rushed forward under the young man's command, sealing off all possible escape routes for the skeletons. In fact, there was no escape route for them at all. Brando knew how they would react. When Brando arranged the cavalry's assault route, his image in the mercenaries' minds was not just described as an excellent general, but a magical one. The battle began with a horizontal sword wind, and 4 or 5 skeleton soldiers were cut in half. Then, Brando took the lead and killed the undead. Any skeleton cavalry who dared to stop him would be thrown 7 or 8 meters away as soon as they entered his attack range. Then, only the necromancer was left in front of him. He beheaded the necromancer with a sword. Then, he gathered the troops and attacked again. The battle ended just like the previous night. Only one of the security cavalry was accidentally stabbed in the left rib. Brando left him behind and let the self-defense regiment follow behind to take over. Then, they continued to move forward. In less than a quarter of an hour, they defeated another undead scout cavalry on the other side of the hill. After 2 battles, there were 3 casualties due to injuries. Brendel naturally had to bandage them one by one, even though it was just for the sake of using his cheat code. His first aid was extremely effective, and it was even more effective than some hemostatic drugs. But his subtle action won him a great reputation. Before that, his prestige among the mercenaries was already at its peak. Even Taryn, who had always been against him, could not help but think that Brando was the god of war. Only the mythical god of war, Mars, had such supercilious strength. But Brendel felt that it was a little boring. The Madara cavalry's movements in this era were so rigid and inflexible, and they were not as flexible as they were after Insursta's reforms. To him, it felt like they were training AI in the past. The only consolation was that he had gained a total of 779 EXP from the 2 battles and successfully reached level 17. At the same time, when the refugees led by Freya began to abandon their carriages, Madara's side found themselves in greater trouble. As everyone knew, Maggot Death Marcus was a half-zombie. The rotten flesh on his body had to be maintained at all times to prevent it from falling off. However, it didn't matter even if his bones were exposed. After all, the apprentice necromancers under him would regularly replenish his bones. The rotting tendons and skin made the zombies stronger and tougher than the skeleton soldiers. But as a general, Marcus arranged the rotting flesh for aesthetic reasons. However, the news from the front line made him feel a little unusual. Before nightfall, his apprentices had sent out more than 10 ghosts to the south, but only half of them had returned on time. Was it that group of refugees? Or was it a trap? Marcus scratched his broken scalp in confusion, and countless fat white maggots spread out from his forehead. These little things quickly got into his eye sockets and the hollow holes on his cheeks. He chewed for a while. He marked the areas that the ghosts were responsible for on the map. There was a possibility that the group of refugees might be on that line. However, since the other party had the ability to counter his ghosts, it meant that it might not be that simple. He had to let those treacherous apprentices send out a second batch of ghosts and confirm the news. Marcus could roughly guess how long it would take, but before that, he could urge his zombie army to speed up so that Ebden and Weezer could complete the encirclement. There was a saying in Madara, no matter how clever a mouse is, it can never escape from a sealed oil tank. Under the siege of Marcus, Cabias, Ebden, Weezer, Diren, Latios, and Gulab, no matter how cunning this small group of refugees was, they would not be able to escape in the end. When the sun rose the next morning, the south of the Valley of Sharp Stones would be completely covered in the shadow of the Roman Black Rose. Madara would be victorious. Marcus reached out his hand and stroked a ghoul that was obediently squatting beside him like a dog. However, this half-zombie general did not know that while he thought that everything was as it should be, the captain of the undead army in front of Brando was in a dilemma. In fact, about 15 minutes ago, the Black Knight Zasser had confirmed that he had lost contact with his two 10-man skeleton cavalry squads. He suspected that he had been targeted by an unknown Aruan army. Therefore, he immediately sent out scouts to contact the 11th Squadron that was not far from him. However, no matter whether Zasser sent out ghosts or skeleton cavalry squads, there was no news in the end. Now, the Black Knight had realized that the problem might be a little big. When Brando and the mercenaries appeared on the hill, they saw that the undead squadron had stopped and was preparing to stand guard. Badam, Redo, and Mano did not see any clues, but Brando secretly frowned. The quality of Madara's mid-level and low-level officers was amazing. The young man could not wait for the undead commander to choose to draw closer to his allies in the other direction. This way, they could safely lead the refugees to pass through this empty area. However, the commander of the undead army made the most accurate judgment in the first place. What are they doing? Taran knew a little about Madara's tactics and could not help but ask. He looked at Brando again and no longer doubted his ability. Stay on guard. We killed their scouts too cleanly and gave them the illusion that an army 3 times their size was targeting them, Brando replied. 3 times. Then why didn't they draw closer to their allies? Aren't they waiting to be separated and surrounded? Their commander is waiting for the scouts of their allies. Aren't they afraid that we will intercept the scouts? Mano wiped his curved sword and answered casually. Brando glanced at him and thought to himself, do you think the scouts can intercept them just because they want to? If they did not have the gargoyles, the strongest scouts in the Amber Sword, they would not have been able to come and go so easily in the area covered by the undead army scouts. Killing the scouts is equivalent to telling them that there are enemies in this direction. The reason why we killed the 2 groups of skeleton knights was because Brando wanted to take down this squadron as well, Redo explained. Does that mean we don't have much time left? Mano asked. 1 hour. End the battle and clean up the battlefield, Brando replied. It was almost 20 minutes later when Freya led the self-defense team into the battlefield. When Zasser saw the ABs on top of the mountain shaking, he finally saw rows of soldiers holding spears walking down from the top of the mountain. He was startled for a moment. The soldiers' attire was different from any of the White Mane Army's legions. He could not help but tilt his head and asked with a hoarse voice, "Where are those soldiers from?" The necromancer beside him immediately lowered his head respectfully. They seemed to be militia. Militia? Zasser was startled. How could the militia quietly eliminate 2 groups of skeleton knights? The Black Knight felt that there was something fishy going on. He could not help but stand up on his horse and made a gesture behind him. Change the bows, mark 140 feet, throw, release. The skeleton soldiers immediately took off the long bows on their waists and opened the bows. Then, they released the bowstrings with a whanked sound, and black arrows flew high into the sky and into the forest of ABs. The mountain wind was strong, and the arrows were not very accurate. But to the militia who did not have much training, it was a great deterrent. The self-defense team that slowly walked down from the top of the mountain paused for a moment and immediately fell into chaos. However, they still had Freya. This girl with a long ponytail rode from the left side of the formation to the right side. She tried to motivate the mercenaries and the White Mane Army's light infantry so that they could lead the militia to attack. Lower your body, lower your head, everyone. Remember what you learned during your training. Do not stop, follow me, remember, this is a battle for your family. Freya took the lead, holding a long sword in her hand, and shouted loudly to encourage the militia. At least it seemed that her work was effective. Under her encouragement, the militia quickly regained their courage and once again reorganized their formation. They slowly pressed down from the top of the mountain. Zasser frowned and ordered another wave of arrows to be fired. After some adjustments, the skeleton soldiers were more accurate this time. A few of the first 3 rows of militia rolled down from the rain of arrows. But after 2 waves of arrows, the militia became calmer. After overcoming their psychological fear, the effectiveness of the projectile weapons was not as great as expected. Zasser immediately changed his hand gesture and pointed at the female knight. The 3rd wave of arrows was obviously aimed at Freya. But the armor on her body flickered with countless spots of light, and every arrow that flew towards her was deflected to the side. This miraculous scene stunned everyone, and the militia cheered in unison. They could not help but shout out Freya's name. Elven Praetorian Army. Seeing this scene, the Black Knight almost laughed out loud. Zasser wondered where this inexplicable army had come from. On the other hand, Brando finally nodded his head, even though he was usually clumsy. But the scene in front of him proved that Freya was the goddess of war in his heart. She was born for the battlefield. He took out his pocket watch and glanced at it. The time was just right. Then Brando pulled out the Thorn of Light, and the elven sword in his hand flickered with a fluorescent light. The sudden flash of light on the battlefield startled everyone, and people from both sides raised their heads and looked over. The elven sword. Zasser recognized the sword at a glance, and he almost screamed as he subconsciously pulled out the sword in his hand. Brando raised the sword high and shouted, "The Shire." The young wizard squire understood and immediately raised the ruby in his hand and pointed at it. Sharpness, division, blade structure. A layer of white lines immediately extended along the tip of the elven sword in Brando's hand. They flickered once and disappeared, leaving only the blade that had been enchanted. The Thorn of Light was already extremely sharp, and now it was even more indestructible. "A new day has arrived, Sir Lord. Remember to pay my maintenance fee." Seal finished casting the spell and said with a grin on his face. Brando smiled faintly. Then he pointed his sword downwards, and his sword pointed towards the Black Knight's position, as if indicating that the battle was about to begin. P.S. I'm disgusted by some idiots who read pirated posts and scolded the author for asking for monthly votes. Depressed. Did everyone enjoy reading the latest chapters? If so, then support me. Thank you. Looking for subscriptions and monthly votes, I really don't want to fall behind. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 82. Brando pulled out the Thorn of Light and pointed the leaf-shaped elven sword at the battlefield. He ordered his knight to prepare to enter the battlefield. They were more than 70 meters away, but they did not charge straight down as expected. The riders tightened their reins and kept their horses at a slow pace. More than 50 riders crossed a small forest and appeared in the vision of the skeleton soldiers from the other side. The Black Knight, Zasser, felt troubled. He could not help but urge his horse to trot forward, waving his black steel sword as he shouted behind the skeletons. Turn! Turn! You idiots! Third and fourth row, put down your spears. Quick! Maggots! He cursed viciously with a hollow, hoarse voice as he divided the skeleton soldiers into 2 groups. One group went to meet the self-defense team led by Freya, while the other group went to restrain the human riders that suddenly appeared on the other side. The spears were raised and then put down with a clatter. The first row pointed upwards, while the second row went over the shoulder blades of the first row. A forest of steel was formed. Brendel's expression did not change as he looked at the cold spear tips. He seemed to be used to the tension before a battle, and there was not a trace of fear on his tense face. He was just adjusting his breathing so that it could adapt to the upcoming battle. He looked at the group of skeletons and felt that this scene was no different from the game. They were annihilating a squadron of Madara, and the commander was similar to a wandering elite monster of the same level. In the past, he had gained a lot from this kind of activity. Most of the squadron leaders in Madara's undead army had the strength of a middle or upper iron ranked, which was about level 20 to 30 in the game. If the settings were not changed, he might see secondary magic equipment of level 20 and above. The elven sword in Brendel's hand was always pointed at Zasser's flank. It was like a restriction, ordering his knights to maintain a slow pace, following a tangential line and slowly turning, getting closer and closer to the side of the skeleton soldier's formation. His calmness gave Zasser a headache. At first glance, the Black Knight knew that his opponent was a seasoned cavalryman and an experienced cavalry commander. Seasoned cavalrymen work together with infantry to achieve victory. By constantly forcing the opponent to change their formation, adjust their direction, and look for gaps to effectively kill them. A newbie would only charge forward without any hesitation and end up with a bloody head. Zasser had already ordered his skeleton soldiers to follow Brando's direction by 120 degrees. The skeleton soldiers turned sluggishly, and it was very troublesome to rearrange their formation. It required his entire squadron of 11 liches. Sometimes, the Black Knight was worried that the thin line behind him would not be able to stop Freya's self-defense team. After the skeleton archers fired their fourth volley of arrows, they began to shoot freely. The militia that came down from the mountain was already within 10 meters of them. These militia consisted of civilians, light infantry, and mercenaries. The first row was made up of people from different regions. Most of them were Butchie, some were Arek, and some were Highlanders. These young and middle-aged people had varying degrees of fear and nervousness on their faces. They breathed out white fog in the cold night, forming a wall. Everything behind them seemed to be blurred. They were holding wooden spears or Madara's nether steel longswords, and all of them gripped them too tightly, causing their movements to become stiff and deformed. Their breathing became erratic, but they were pushed forward subconsciously by the people behind them. Right in front of them was a sea of white skeletons. The undead would never be afraid, nor would they be excited. One by one, they remained motionless, holding their spears with both hands. There was no joy, no sadness, and no thought. Only the orange flames of the soul burned in their empty eye sockets. But it was this kind of enemy that was terrifying. The girl with a long ponytail was anxious as she looked at the enemies. The future goddess of war knew that if she let them go, she would be the first to collapse. She gritted her teeth and turned her horse around. Then she raised her sword and pierced into the gap between the two sides like a flash of green lightning. That was the transformation from a militia to a female knight. Freya's mind was blank at that moment. She did not think about anything else. She only knew that she wanted to win, she wanted to help Brando, and she wanted to walk down this long road with everyone. The thorny forest formed by the spears came into view. It was densely packed. Freya. Romaine carefully hid at the top of the mountain. Of course, no one knew that she had snuck out. But when she saw Freya's risky move, she could not help but widen her eyes in shock. Then she suddenly heard a dispute behind her. The Roman was stunned. She turned around and saw the girl who seemed to be called Sue snatching a horse and jumping on it. She then rushed all the way to the battlefield. So she knew how to ride a horse too. The Roman lay on the rock and thought that riding a horse was interesting. Freya gritted her teeth and raised her steel sword. Clack, clack, clack. Every spear that was aimed at her was deflected into the air. She rode her horse and charged through Madara's front line, causing the skeletons to retreat one after another. But she could only deal with a small number of them. The spears passed through the line of defense. The feather of the wind lit up and circled around the ponytailed girl's half-body armor. It was about 7 millimeters thick and was enough to cut through most of the attacks. But there were still some that escaped. Two spears burst out from the forest of thorns and hit Freya's breastplate, leaving a white mark on both sides. The other spear pierced into her waist, and red blood gushed out like a fountain. Freya grunted and cut down the spear with her sword. Then she gritted her teeth and turned around, leaving the battlefield from the other side. Behind her, the self-defense regiment and the undead army of Madara had collided. The spears of the skeletons were lifted up high by Freya, and they were forced to retreat. But when they collided with the militia, they were unable to withstand the huge force and were forced to retreat. He was shocked when he felt the line of defense behind him crumbling. He thought that his undead army would be able to hold on for a while and buy him some time, but he did not expect it to collapse so quickly. He turned his head and saw the female knight wearing the sky-blue elven armor. She was focused on encouraging her subordinates, the White Mane Army's light infantry, and the mercenaries to form a torrent that continued to advance forward. They continued to advance forward and open up a bigger path of victory. The Black Knight could not help but take a deep breath. If he had enough liches, he could have reorganized the formation. This was one of the main characteristics of the undead army. But now, he was focused on the other side. Brando and his knight were eyeing him. Thinking of this, he was shocked. He turned around and saw that the group of human knights had adjusted their direction and were facing him. The knights gradually got closer and their horses began to trot. Brando raised his sword. The 50 knights behind him raised their swords. Kill! Erwin will win. The earth rumbled as the knights roared into the forest. The rocks on the ground trembled as if they were dancing. However, the skeletons that were slowly retreating from behind were messing up Zasar's formation. More than a dozen liches were surrounded and helpless. He chopped down a skeleton soldier that blocked his way and shouted in a hoarse voice, "Let's go! Flatten the spears!" Brendel was as fast as a black meteor. He lowered his body and swung the White Raven sword art forward. The wind pressure from the White Raven sword art was like a scythe that swept across the first and second rows of skeletons, causing them to fall to the ground. He then let go of the reins and raised his hands. His thick leather gloves emitted 2 soft blue rays and deflected the 2 rows of spears that were heading towards him. Then, he and his horse crashed into a group of skeletons. A few skeletons were sent flying by the huge horse. It looked like a dangerous scene, but in fact, Brando's dexterity had reached 4.3 ounces, which was several times that of a normal human. The skeleton's movements were as slow as snails in his eyes. The gap of a few seconds was a huge loophole that he could easily exploit. Protect the horses. With Brendel's loud roar, the entire cavalry crashed into the forest of undead spears. The first and second rows of skeletons fell to the ground, and the skeletons behind them retreated and squeezed together with the liches who were supervising the battle. The mercenaries were very skilled. They deflected the spears of Madara's undead and cut into the enemy's formation. They used the momentum of their horses to penetrate the back 3 rows of skeletons. Then, they tried their best to move aside and let the second row of skeletons crash into them. Madara's formation was pushed back again and was on the verge of collapse. In the first charge, only 2 or 3 knights fell off their horses. Most of their horses were injured, but they could still fight their way out with their iron-ranked strength. It could be said that Brando's charge was a group of Erwin Sergeant Major rank and above. The impact was so great that it was beyond his expectations. Although the attack did not penetrate the 200-strong undead army, it almost pushed them to the brink of collapse. Even Zasar could not believe that he had lost so quickly. The Black Knights saw 2 necromancers casting Veil of Darkness in front of Brendel's army, but Brendel ignored them as though he did not see them at all. Half of the necromancers' bodies fell to the ground in front of Zasar, burning with white holy flames. Another lich tried to hide further away and use decay, but he was cut in half by the young man's backhanded sword from 7 to 8 meters away. The lich fell on his back. Brando turned around again and swung his sword down. The elven sword passed through the skeletons, and the skeletons around him fell apart. White flames rose from the incomplete skeletons. The sacred flames connected as if the light of heaven surrounded the young knight. The demons danced and turned into ashes in an instant. It was as if he was walking on flat ground in front of an army of 10,000. Everyone couldn't help but gasp with their mouths agape. Brando raised his head again and locked his gaze on the Black Knight, Sasser. P.S. So sad, are the meat people complaining about that half-zombie? I wipe my tears. Also, before the work is released, let me first explain, the unit of energy level is Oz, not Z. Fine, if you want to blame someone, blame this stupid font. It has nothing to do with me. Today, TAT encountered a very sad matter and lost a few thousand yuan. Please comfort me. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 83. Even an army of 10,000 could not withstand a single strike. What kind of momentum was this? Not only the Black Knight, but the militia and mercenaries in the distance were also stunned. Was this still a human? Even the legendary Knight of the Templar was not as good as this, right? The humans, who were already in the rhythm of the attack, suddenly cheered in unison. Their morale was greatly boosted, and they almost burst out 3 or 4 times their combat power, pushing the undead back. Seeing this scene, Sasser knew that there was nothing he could do, but the dark and proud blood in his body prevented him from admitting defeat. What kind of army was this? Judging from their attire, they were just a ragtag army. They were not even as good as the militia. They were just a temporary army formed by a group of frightened refugees. However, they had a group of impressive backbone and commanders. Sasser could not help but wonder who they were. Where did they come from? Aween was just a dying kingdom. How could the rising Madara be defeated by such an army in a country that should be buried in the dust of history? Even its own citizens had lost the reason to fight for this land, and Sasser did not think that he should accept defeat from the other side. The Black Knight drew his sword, and the soul fire in his chest could not help but burn fiercely. He immediately turned around and pulled the lich beside him, pointed to the position of Brando, and ordered it to use Soul Pierce to attack the enemy. Then he patted his warhorse's neck, and it began to trot. Together with the 3 black warriors, he separated the skeletons in front of him and went to meet the enemy. Sasser believed that even if he risked his life, there was still a chance to kill the enemy in the chaos. He wanted to take back the glory that belonged to him. This was the pride of Madara, the pride of the Dark Nobles. But at the same time, Brando also noticed the situation here. He immediately pointed to the Shire beside him. The young wizard immediately shot a white light from his hand and hit the lich who was casting a spell. But what Charles didn't expect was that after his spell hit the lich's ribs, it actually bounced off and dissipated into thin air. The Shire level was too low. Brando frowned when he saw the resistance effect of the spell. Since Brando was swinging his sword at the skull of a few skeleton soldiers, he was destined to not be able to withdraw his sword in time. However, Brando reacted quickly and raised his left hand. A bright sky-blue triangular formation appeared in his palm. The necromancer's secondary weapon, Spirit Pierce, was already out, while Brendel inserted 3 wind elemental crystals into his elemental pool and displayed the wind elemental card, Energy Loss. The sky blue card symbolized the power of the wind. The wind was flexible and unpredictable, and the spells were mysterious. The wind-type card of Fate also had a similar power. A transparent, jagged spiritual wave shot out from the lich's forehead like a sharp knife. It crossed half of the battlefield in an instant and went straight to Brando and the others. But it immediately stopped in the middle of the battlefield. It was a strange scene. It was as if time had stopped for a moment. Then, like a storm, it refracted back with a sharp whistle. Along the way, there was a series of muffled sounds, and countless shriveled heads of the undead exploded. Even the headless necromancer swayed on the skeletal warhorse and fell down. Magic and martial arts. Those mercenaries who were less knowledgeable were still fine, but Redo, Mano, Batum, and Dragon Subduing Tower were so scared that they almost threw away their swords. In their opinion, Brando was a young man who was not even 20 years old and had the strength of a middle-ranked iron rank. He was also an excellent and talented general. He was also very knowledgeable. He was already considered a rare genius. But now, they saw that he was also a wizard who could at least fight against a low-ranked lich. Could it be that he was actually a rare reverend? He was not afraid. The undead were destined to not be able to feel the reality of fear. But he was a little shaken. He did not know who the young man was. He held an elven sword, had excellent combat skills, and commanded calmly and calmly. How could such a person be unknown in Erewhon? While he was hesitating, 2 of the black warriors had already passed him and went straight to Brando. But the young man's expression did not change. In the blink of an eye, he blasted away the 2-handed sword in the hands of the first black warrior. It was as if the black warrior's strength of 5 ounces was fake. Then, he raised his sword high and slashed at the shoulder of the black warrior. The elven sword was like a silver, vertical line from top to bottom. With a loud bang, the black warrior and his horse were smashed to the ground. Brando turned around and punched the great sword of the second black warrior, causing it to fly to the side. Then, he clamped his legs on the horse's abdomen, causing it to move forward and grab the hilt of the black warrior's sword. His right hand pierced through the heart of the black warrior and pulled him down from the horse's back. He squinted his eyes and saw the -72 damage that rose above the black warrior's head. He could not help but think that the Thorn of Light's attack on dark creatures was really high. But these numbers projected on his retina made him feel strange. Sometimes, he wondered if someone had installed a microcomputer in his brain when he transmigrated. Of course, that was just a joke. Brando threw away the black warrior that was burning from the inside. He straightened his body and faced the third black warrior. He exchanged a blow with the black warrior and then cut him down from the horse's back. When the black warrior fell from the horse, Brando saw a silver necklace hanging from his sword. He reacted quickly and grabbed it. He was pleasantly surprised to find that it was a necklace that gave +0.3 strength. Actually, Brando felt that it was a little strange. The sub-magic equipment in the game should be similar to common equipment. Even the captain NPC should have at least one of them. But until now, he had only seen the Roman spider ring, swift dagger, and this necklace. In fact, the magic equipment in the game were usually differentiated by their rarity. The black iron equipment's rarity was alchemy, also known as sub-magic equipment. The bronze equipment's rarity was low light, also known as low magic equipment. The brass equipment's rarity was magic. This level was a real magic equipment. For example, Brando's Ring of the Wind Empress and Freya's Ring of Flame, they had a significant characteristic, which was that they had at least one magic power that could be inspired. The silver equipment's rarity was ancient. This level was a rare magic equipment. For example, Brando's Thorn of Light. This type of magic equipment's power could even change the strength of the opponent to a certain extent. It was already considered a treasure. The gold equipment's rarity was fantasy. This level of magic equipment must have been passed down in the ballads of bards or items of fantasy. But although there were many legends that had been passed down in the history of a country, there were only a few that had been truly grasped by people. The dark gold equipment's rarity was mythical. This level of magic equipment's rarity was mysterious. With Brando's knowledge, he had only seen it in the hands of a few core members of a few major guilds. Of course, in the game, an item that was mysterious was often a symbol of status. As for divine artifacts, apart from the Mercury staff and a few other ancient lost artifacts, most of them were in the hands of the legendary Almighty. They were either the rulers of a country or the gods in the heavens. For example, Saint Tassol's Ring of the Wind Empress, or the Sky Dragon's Holy Lance, Azure. But in fact, in addition to the above abnormal things, Glimmerth low magic items and alchemy sub-magic items were still very common in the game. Vaunt was a high magic world, and magic in some rich places was indeed not as mysterious as people imagined it to be. But after coming to this world and battling Madara for so long, he did not see many of them. Even the boss of the Golden Tree did not drop any legendary items. If it wasn't for the fact that the loot in Gerald's tomb did not disappoint him, he would have doubted whether there was a difference between the game and reality. But today, the necklace that the Black Knight dropped made him feel relieved. It seemed that the Grimoires region was a little too remote. But while he was in a daze, a black sword came at him. Brando was shocked and instinctively dodged to the side. The Black Knight was already in front of him. The young man could not help but look around. The Black Knight had lost his momentum. Even his guards were all dead. But the Black Knight still did not turn around and surrender. Could it be that he wanted to challenge him? He was stunned. Freya pressed on the wound on her waist with one hand, and she could not help but frown. But the ponytailed girl felt a little strange. She felt that she was more concerned about the damage to the half-plate of the Zephyr. She thought for a while and convinced herself that it was because the plate was too valuable. The militia was chasing the defeated skeleton soldiers to the side of the valley. Brando's order was not to let any of the undead escape. It seemed that he did not need to say that because the soldiers and civilians who had been frightened for a day and night would do it willingly. She and the rest of the militia were needed to maintain order in the pursuit of the undead so that they would not hurt their own people. Freya rode on her horse and chased after them. When she passed by a gravel beach, she saw a skeleton soldier with a broken leg crawling up from the ground. She was about to give it another stab when she saw a figure dashing down like a gust of wind and chopping the skeleton down. The figure stopped. It was Sue, who was wearing a leather dress. Sue. The bronze-skinned girl rode over and looked at her with concern. She whispered, "Freya, are you hurt?" "I'm fine. Have you seen Brando?" Freya turned around and found herself on the other side of the canyon with the self-defense team. Him. That guy didn't even dare to accept a knight's challenge. Why are you so concerned about him? Sue thought for a moment and replied. Knight challenge. The female knight's long ponytail froze. P.S. Everyone, don't be like this TAT. I'm not asking for votes. You can still vote actively. Ours, another few hundred votes were thrown out. It's already a bad day, so please use your tickets to soothe my wounded soul. Chapter 84. A Knight's Challenge. The silver-haired girl put down her teacup and could not help but laugh. Only the Black Knight could come up with such a stalling tactic, but she soon sighed softly. The princess could not help but turn her head and stare blankly at the clean and bright arched window. Her gaze passed through the dust floating up and down in the sunlight that slanted in from outside the tall window, and a hint of worry flashed in her pale silver-gray eyes. For the outcome of the war, he would rather put down his honor and even give up his dignity as a knight. Was it because of the blooming black rose of Bramanto? But what could gather the people in a land that had been in chaos for thousands of years? Or was there some unknown changes happening in the kingdom in the darkness? The girl did not expect her accidental guess to become a reality. She turned back and looked at Oberway speechlessly. When the common ancestor of the Erewhon, Sage Eric, led the people to independence from Cruz, it was to resist the endless exploitation of the southern land by the Empire. Our country was founded to stop the arrogance and greed of the Empire's nobles. The princess said softly, "But today, the nobles among us have become greedy and arrogant. Have we lost the ambition and the sense of honor to defend justice, so much so that we have lost the ability to gather the people?" "I dare not say that. But although the nobles are rotten, at least the people still believe in the royal family," Oberway replied. The girl nodded and felt a little better. Oberway looked at the girl and saw her thoughts. He continued to answer, "Even the most rotten soil can sprout new shoots. Your Highness, since the late King Antonax, the kingdom trained the militia and formed the guards to plant the seeds. The young man I met could also give up his honor, which means that the younger generation of Erewhon is not much worse than Madara." But neither of them pointed out that Brando was actually a member of the Highland Knights faction and had nothing to do with the royal family. The princess could not help but think about what supported Brando to give up his honor. Wasn't he a knight? How could a knight refuse his opponent's challenge? What the future princess regent did not expect was that Brando was not a knight at all. The Black Knight, Sasser, did not expect this either, so he could only die a humiliating death in the chaos. Brando did not care about him at all. He only took Sasser off his horse when he passed by, and then turned around. The moment they passed each other, Erewhon's rising star and Madara's outstanding younger generation looked into each other's eyes. What Brando saw was the burning soul fire in the Black Knight's eyes, the pursuit of true honor and faith. He knew that one person could never be strong, but when thousands of people gathered together, it would create a terrible force. For thousands of years, Madara, the Black Rose of Brahmanto, was just a geographical concept. It was a process that made even the cold undead creatures feel honor and recognition from the bottom of their hearts. Unfortunately, he could not participate, and had no intention of participating in such a period of history. In contrast to Brando, Sasser only saw the cold pragmatism in the young human knight's eyes. Perhaps for the young man who had experienced this period of history, all illusions were no longer suitable. Brando was more willing to believe in his own strength to the nobles and the royal family. Even if he wanted to save Erewhon, the Valkyrie, and everyone else, he could only rely on himself. Brando knew the future, but he also knew that no one would be willing to believe in this future. Therefore, he needed to become stronger, and let his wings become fuller little by little, so that the world would have to take his opinion seriously. Compared to that, all the other false titles were just floating clouds. The Black Knight actually thought that he could force him to change his mind with a little trick. How naive. Brando looked back. Even on the battlefield, a knight's duel required a notary, a deputy of both sides, a venue, and a series of etiquette and ceremonies. As long as he was not half crazy, he would never agree to this ridiculous proposal. Perhaps in the eyes of the people of this era, knights should choose to respect each other. Of course, this was still a society that followed the spirit of classicism. Unfortunately, Brando was not just Brando, half of his soul represented another world. Fair competition. No, modern warfare emphasized unrestricted warfare and asymmetrical warfare. Therefore, this created the biggest doubt of the Black Knight before he died. When he saw the mercenaries swarming behind him and stabbing their shining blades into his chest, he died with his eyes wide open. How could he refuse? Was he still a knight? The undead army had been utterly defeated. Brando pulled the reins and let the warhorse trot a few steps to stop. Then he turned the horse around and saw that the others were looking at him strangely. It was no wonder. After all, as a knight in this world, refusing a challenge was indeed a big thing. Although these mercenaries had rich combat experience, it was inevitable that they would be influenced by the views of the world. But he raised his sword and said to the others, "You may be wondering why I didn't accept his challenge, but the reason is actually very simple. The challenge between knights comes from the mutual respect between nobles, not a holy challenge with deceitful thoughts. This is a blasphemy to the knight's rules." He added, "As for why I said this, think about it carefully." Everyone was enlightened, but Reto, Tower, and the others were more or less confused. Brando looked at their expressions and continued, "Of course, this is all nonsense." To put it more crudely, "I'm not interested in a bet without a stake." This sentence was obviously to the mercenaries' liking. Many of them could not help but cheer loudly, especially Mano, who nodded repeatedly. He almost thought that Brando was his soulmate. But the young man still had some doubts when he looked back at Reynolds, but he understood that he could only explain so much. In fact, he did not need to hide anything. This night was so urgent that he had no time to sort out everything one by one. Just like now, he immediately gestured to the others to clean up the battlefield and let them quickly pick up the spoils and clean up the battlefield. At the same time, he jumped off his horse and walked to the corpses of Zasser and the Black Warriors. It was time to reap the rewards. The 3 Black Warriors had been burned into a pile of white ash from the inside out, except for their armor and some small items that they carried with them. These things looked disgusting, but in the eyes of players like Brando, they were equivalent to spoils of war. He kicked away the empty breastplate. The Black Warriors were tall, and their armor would probably have to be melted down again to be suitable for human wear. Therefore, this thing was worthless in his eyes. But his goal was not this thing, but the magical items that the Black Warriors might have carried with them. Unfortunately, he didn't get much. He only found a secondary snake-shaped ring with a rarity of black iron in one of the corpses. It was what the natives of this world called an alchemy item. +0. 1 dexterity, but it was better than nothing. But Brando was not depressed. His main goal was not the 3 Black Warriors. They were just an appetizer, and he was glad that he got something. In fact, his main goal was the Black Knight, a level 20 elite creature. Brando walked to Zasser. The Black Knight's half-body armor was suitable for him. Unfortunately, the mercenaries did not know how to cherish it and opened several holes in the breastplate. When Brando saw this, he could not help but curse. These guys did not know how to think for their commander. Compared to Freya, who was a militia commander, he, as a knight commander, did not even have armor to use. But even so, Brando still squatted down and opened the man's pouch. The first thing he looked for was the pouch, because most of the magical items and magic amulets were kept there. Brando's EXP did not lose its effect. He found a snake-shaped statue and 3 magic amulets. Magic amulets were good things. According to legend, they were originally made by the wizards in the ice forest in the north of Wonde. As long as you carried them, you would naturally gain good luck. But the craftsmanship of these magic items gradually spread after the Year of the 3 Hills and became an important craftsmanship. In the game, every magic amulet was at least bronze, because they had an important characteristic, which was that they were not limited by the total number of magic items that could be carried. Just like the 3 amulets in Brando's hands. The 3 magic amulets' attributes were +1 HP, +2 HP, and +0. 1 innate protection. It was the cheapest item in the market, but at least it was better than nothing. Brando put away the amulets and looked at the snake-shaped statue carefully. He immediately realized that it was a poisoned amulet. The poison amulet was a magic item. Most of them were made by the druids in the forest, but some of them came from the hands of the liches. Once activated, it would release a poison spell on the blade, 12 ounces, losing HP every minute and gradually weakening the user. It was not a good thing, but Brando could not help but curse in his heart. What a sneaky bastard, pretending to be a knight. Does a knight use poison? He could not help but think that he was not a righteous person. Otherwise, he would have suffered a great loss. He put the amulets away. After all, his current identity was still a Highland knight. It would be a big problem if someone who knew their stuff saw it. The rules of a knight in this world were very complicated. If they violated the rules, they would be stripped of their title. If it was serious, they would be burned at the stake. That was not a joke. Then Brando turned the body over and checked the neck and hands, which were the most likely places to have magic items. But he did not see a ring or a necklace. Instead, he saw a frosty glass bracelet. Of course, it was not a glass bracelet. Elemental bracelet. Brando was shocked and hurriedly pulled the thing out of the Black Knight's body. Although the elemental bracelet was only of bronze equipment, it had a high energy level. The lowest level elemental bracelet that Brando knew of was at least 25 ounces, and the attributes of this item were also very practical. It could add a certain amount of elemental damage to close-range or long-range physical attacks. The amount of damage depended on the energy level of the bracelet. For example, a 25-ounce bracelet would add at least 4 to 4 points of elemental damage. In his previous life, the Thorn of Light's damage was only 9 to 9 points without doubling the damage. Brando suppressed the ecstasy in his heart. This item used to be as expensive as a silver, rare magic item. When it was at its peak, it was one of the equipment that he could only dream of. Attack was the life of a physical profession in the early stages. It was a pity that this bracelet was a level 20 equipment. Brando could only look at it to satisfy his craving. He carefully put this item into his bag. It was probably as important as the Thorn of Light. It was even more important. After all, the Thorn of Light was only a temporary longsword. Its sharpness and hardness were not enough to withstand the use of a medium iron swordsman. Brando actually had a replacement for the elven sword in mind, but he had not put it into action yet. However, the elemental bracelet was different. There were 2 slots for the bracelet. Brando thought that it would be difficult to find a better replacement before he reached level 40. And at level 40, he would at least have the strength of an upper silver. After putting away these important spoils of war and making sure that he did not miss anything, Brando sighed and stood up. The rewards from this battle were too great. Other than a total of 770 EXP, the equipment he obtained almost doubled the energy level of his equipment. Especially the elemental bracelet, which was unexpected good news. If he could get the elemental ring and the other bracelet, he would have a full set of pure attack equipment. Brando was even confident that he would be able to find trouble with the young black dragon at Viro's Needle Hill Road before he reached level 30. After all, the map of Chi Dragon was a huge temptation to any player who used to play games. Brando was no exception. He could not help but blow on the edge of the Thorn of Light as if he had already obtained the dragon's treasure. Of course, there was still an insurmountable gap between reality and fantasy. Of course, he would not get carried away. Soon, mercenaries came to clean up the corpses beside him. The young man turned around and found that most of the people present had already obtained something. Reto, Mano, and the others were also knowledgeable people. Their target was the liches. After all, even 1 or 2 alchemy items could greatly increase one's strength. No one would hate an increase in one's strength. After cleaning up the battlefield, Brando looked at the time. From the beginning of the battle until now, a total of 45 minutes had passed. The gargoyles could only scout in one direction, and Madara's skeleton cavalry could appear at any time, so they had to make the best use of their time. The gargoyles could only scout in one direction, and Madara's skeleton cavalry could appear at any time. The group of refugees had already moved forward under the leadership of a few core members. With the gargoyles clearing the way for them, Brando was not worried that the refugees would encounter any trouble. Now, he just wanted to find Freya and bring the others to chase after her. At least until now, his plan had been carried out smoothly. The only thing left was to play hide and seek with Madara. Of course, he also had to wait for the moment when the constellation of the Night King appeared in the sky. Thinking of this, the young man could not help but take out the white deer statue and looked up at the dark sky. Note, some explanations about the equipment's energy level. The total energy level of an individual's magical equipment is determined by the individual's total magic coordination. The calculation formula is basic 20 plus willpower x 10 plus total level x 5. Unit is also in OZ. For example, Brando has a total level of 17 and a willpower of 2. 9. Therefore, he can carry equipment equivalent to 134 ounces. Calculation formula 20 plus 2, 9 by 10 plus 17 by 5. Among the equipment he carries and uses, the Thorn of Light and the Ring of the Wind Empress each cost 20 ounces, the protective gloves cost 5 ounces, the Gargoyle Talisman and the Soul Statue, White Deer, cost 7 ounces, and the necklace and secondary snake ring cost a total of 62 ounces. From the first day of the year, I went home happily for dinner. Then I ate potato chips for the whole night. The power went out on the 3rd of January. On the 4th of January, I lost a few $1,000s in the morning. After eating in the afternoon, I started to feel bloated again and my stomach kept feeling uncomfortable. Then this morning, the power went out again until 1 p.m. Not only did my stomach stop feeling uncomfortable, it got worse. I had a stomachache for the whole day. At night, when my friends came to ask me to go out for hot pot, I did not go to TAT. I will try my best to make up for it when it gets better. Thank you for your support. Also, thank you Brother Razor for the $100,000 reward. This is the first time I have received a $100,000 reward. In addition, there are many friends who have tipped me and voted for me every month. Thank you. Your support is the motivation for me to persevere. Also, Amber Group 1 is almost full. I will now announce the number of Group 2. Thank you Knight for providing the QQ group. Amber Sword Group 2, 130957343. Finally, let me end this digression with the usual pleas for votes. Enduring the stomachache and the cold, I look at everyone pleading for votes with tears in my eyes. Although I haven't updated much in the past 2 days, I will definitely work harder when I feel better. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the legal reading. Chapter 85. After defeating Zasser, Brando continued to lead the refugees south. They attacked another undead army about an hour and a half later. After replicating the previous victory, the refugees cruised to the gap between the second and third layers of Madara's search line. In front of them were 2 nets formed by D-Ren, Gulob, and Ladios, while behind them was an army of skeletons that covered the mountains and plains. It seemed dangerous, but in fact, it enjoyed a kind of ingenious balance, like the calm waves in the eye of a typhoon. Although the battle inevitably brought about casualties, Brando's plan still worked. The Madara undead army cruising south of the deer hunting hills soon discovered a huge problem. The refugees that were supposed to be in their encirclement seemed to have grown wings and disappeared at this moment. After Magid Death, Marcus, Ebden, and Weezer joined forces, they went south to join forces with Gulob, D-Ren, and Ladios. But even after they plowed through the area, they still did not find the group of refugees that had escaped into the Silver Sparrow Mountains. Could it be that the information was wrong? As a cunning general, Marcus did not believe in luck. He immediately guessed that the refugees were hiding in a valley, waiting for the undead army to sweep through the hills. Marcus immediately ordered all the undead army in the area to release all their scouts and search in all directions with the meeting point as the center. They must find the group of refugees. But as soon as the scouts were released, Gulob, the commander of the 17th column of Madara's Obsidian Legion, quickly found that he had lost sight of one of his squadrons. The Black Knight, Zasser, who led them, seemed to have disappeared. And before he could figure out what was going on, D-Ren, the commander of the 12th column, also encountered the same problem. Soon, both of them realized that a mysterious army might have quietly broken through their encirclement and circled behind them. But how did this happen? How did a group of 1,000 or 2,000 people escape from the net formed by dozens of scouts? If it was luck, then this luck was too good. But the two of them did not dare to be negligent and immediately informed Marcus of this news. Damned Maggot was enraged when he heard that. He almost threw the scroll box containing the battle map at the two men's faces. It pointed at their noses and scolded, "You useless trash." The third batch of graduates from the Roman Black Rose Academy were all worthless maggots. Get out of my sight. Guluabu and Ren didn't dare to refute and retreated dejectedly. Then, Marcus calmed down and summoned Ebden and Wisa. He ordered the undead army to spread out to the two sides to prevent the refugees from getting out of the encirclement. Next, he issued a second order, asking the commanders of the other three columns to search in the opposite direction. Although it looked down on Madara's new dark nobles, just like how it looked down on Kabia's, it had no choice but to rely on their strength. After all, this was the power of Madara's new generation. It was only worried that it had reacted too late. But in reality, Brendel had just passed by the Blood Shaman Ladio's second squadron, and was about 3 miles behind the enemy's third squadron. His plan was a little different from what Marcus had expected. Brando galloped past the refugees on both sides. He pointed out the backbone of the refugees on horseback and ordered them to turn back. His action was not strange. In fact, Brando had already ordered the refugees to avoid Madara's undead scouts several times. When the backbone of the refugees saw the knight, they subconsciously ordered the refugees in the area they were in charge of to turn back. However, there were also some clever ones who leaned forward and asked in a fawning manner, "Sir, did you discover those monsters' cavalry scouts in front again?" "No, no. Tell them to turn north and throw away all their belongings except for food, water, and weapons. We have to speed up." Brendel sat on the horse's back and looked at them as he answered. His words shocked them. North? Wasn't that the direction of Madara's army? But they had escaped from that direction with great difficulty. Why did they have to go back? Could it be that this lord had suddenly lost his mind? Brando tightened the reins and turned the horse around. He looked at these anxious people and comforted them. "Don't worry, I haven't lost my mind. Go and do it. If you want to live, this is our only chance." Everyone looked at Brando and was speechless. But other than believing in this knight, what else could they do? The nobles of Fortress Reden had already abandoned them. Only this benevolent knight stayed behind to share their joys and sorrows, leading them out of trouble time and time again. Moreover, this knight was so wise and brave. According to the mercenaries, this knight was like the reincarnation of the god of war, invincible on the battlefield. Although this sounded like bragging, the news of victory and the endless supply of weapons from the front lines all proved this point. When they thought of this, their previous doubts could not help but be shaken. But what was this knight planning to do? Could it be that the sword in his hand could really lead the way to a miracle, just like what those security cavalrymen had said? Brando saw that they did not speak, and understood that his prestige had already been established. But he felt a little regretful. This prestige was only temporarily maintained in this difficult situation. Once the first war of the Black Rose ended, this glory would vanish like smoke. Thus, he knew that only his personal strength could bring him benefits from this war. He told himself that he must see the direction of history clearly and not be blinded by these illusions. He thought of this clearly and turned the horse around to continue forward. As if they felt the tension in the air, the mercenaries who were scattered all around began to gather towards their lord. There was a rumbling sound in the valley, and everyone stopped to watch this scene. It was as if a king was gathering his knight. The battle was about to begin again, and everyone's nerves could not help but tense up. After all, this night seemed to be easy, but in fact, it was a race against time. Apart from the battle, Brando almost always held the Shire's silver pocket watch. At the most tense moment, the cold sweat on his hand even soaked the case of the watch. How thrilling was the previous battle! Sometimes, it was only a few minutes before another undead scout arrived. And these few minutes were the difference between heaven and hell. Brando finally came to the front of the team, where Freya and her self-defense team had been waiting for a long time. In addition to her, there were Badam, Mano, Terran, Redo, Uliel and others. They had all received Brando's notice early, but they did not understand the young man's plan. They had already circled to the back of the undead army, and it seemed that half of the plan had been achieved. But now, why did Brando want them to go back the way they came? If Brando had not firmly occupied the position of leader in their hearts, perhaps these experienced mercenaries would not have just waited for him to explain. Even Freya, who sat weakly on the horse's back, looked hesitant and uneasy. She looked at him several times and wanted to say something, but stopped in the end. Brando glanced at her. In fact, he had already received news that the undead were spreading out to the two sides, trying to block the imaginary group of refugees. And the other three columns seemed to be sweeping towards the rear again. It seemed that they did not have many choices. Even these people who had been following him could not help but wonder if they were going to move along the circle to the two sides and race against the dead maggots. This was not surprising. It was human nature to seek advantages and avoid disadvantages. But Madara had gathered 2 battalions and 7 columns in this area, and even if these numbers of undead gathered in one area, the area they occupied was still shockingly large. The refugees had to take a detour of nearly 20 miles to completely avoid coming into contact with the undead. Therefore, it was unrealistic to accomplish such a feat, especially when the undead were also spreading out to the two sides. In fact, Brando's plan was to let these people go back the way they came and give the zombie lord an unexpected surprise. After defeating 2 Madara squadrons, the weapons collected were enough to arm an army of 500 to 600 people. And after Brando drew out all the people who could be armed, regardless of gender, from the more than 2,000 refugees, the self-defense regiment had expanded to nearly 500 people. Of course, as long as he assigned Redo and the others to command, he could draw more people. But that was completely unnecessary. When Madara's army spread out too quickly to the two sides, the strength in the center would inevitably be weakened. The conditions were ripe for a counterattack. Brando had much better scouts than Madara. Of course, he had the right to choose when and how to fight with Madara's army. This was also his biggest advantage. Now, he was going to use this advantage to go back to the heart of Madara, so that they would not know what he wanted. But he stopped the horse and did not rush to explain his intentions. Instead, he first looked at Freya. The girl's face was pale and she looked like she was about to collapse. He could not help but ask, "Why don't you go down and rest first, Freya?" Freya glared at him angrily. Brando smiled bitterly. "Who told you to be brave and get hurt? I told you to let me bandage you, but you didn't listen." When the future Valkyrie heard this, her face turned red all the way to her neck. She thought, what kind of shameless words is this guy saying? How could she, a girl, let him bandage her? It was simply outrageous. She hated Brando for spouting nonsense. She could not help but turn her head and ignore him, so as not to let others misunderstand. But Brando was a little stunned when he saw this scene. The Shire was not lying to him, right? How could he tell that Freya liked him? He could not help but look back at the young mage with a suspicious look. "My lord, is there anything I can do for you?" The Shire was scared by his stare and had to bite the bullet. "No, no." Brando quickly shook his head. Brando turned his head again and found a group of mercenaries staring at him and Freya and snickering. In fact, for a day and night, they had already inquired about the relationship between this lord and the 2 ladies by the Shire's side. Of course, it was this kind of Brando that really made them feel a sense of familiarity, and pulled him back from the many halos in their hearts. People were always willing to believe in people like themselves. They would revere geniuses, but they would not trust them from the bottom of their hearts. What are you laughing at? No, 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 my lord, you're mistaken. Everyone replied in unison. I hope so. Brando looked at these guys angrily. Otherwise, be careful of your butts. Well, I don't want to explain too much to you. I only have one thing to say, prepare for battle. He pulled out his sword. When the refugees once again gathered under his sword, Brendel's eyes lit up. When this huge army turned around, the blood wizard Ladios, who bore the brunt of the attack, met with great misfortune. This time, Brando did not hide his tactical intentions. He only had one tactic, and that was to be faster. The 500 self-defense regiment and 50 cavalry were like a dragon that ran over the platoon that Ladios had arranged to his left. More than 200 skeleton soldiers were simply unable to stop Brando's relentless assault. When the young man led his knight and swept through like a whirlwind, Ladios only found out that he had lost his left wing half an hour later. When the intermediate necromancer passed the news back to Meads, Brando had already advanced for another 3 miles. At this moment, he was stepping on the corpse of the platoon leader that was left in Gulab's hands. His subordinates accelerated. They kept accelerating. He could not help but look at the white deer statue. There were about 50 minutes before the knight's throne appeared in the night sky. P.S. Today's monthly votes are only 40 votes. Tears. Is there really no hope for the top 3? This chapter has more than 3,800 words, a slight apology. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 86. Marcus found that he had suddenly lost control of the battle. He had nearly 10,000 undead under his command, but they were of no use at all. Ever since he discovered that the group of refugees had disappeared, it seemed that everything was developing out of his control. At first, Gulab and Diran each lost a platoon, allowing the refugees to circle around to the back of the army. With Marcus's keen senses, he immediately smelled something unusual. The half-zombie immediately determined that the refugees were rushing to his flanks, intending to break through the blockade of the undead army. So he immediately ordered Weezer and Ebden to spread out to the flanks, trying to block the refugees' escape route. But he did not expect that in less than half an hour after the order was given, Ladios and Gulab lost their left flank, which was the group of refugees. No, it should be said that it was the mysterious army. Now, Brando had risen to the level of Madara's regular army in Marcus' mind. In fact, the real Madara's regular army probably did not have this ability. According to Brando's army's decision-making and combat ability, it should at least have the strength of Erwin's Imperial Guard. Even Marcus almost could not help but think that he had encountered Erwin's Imperial Guard or the Free Cavalry. He could not help but wonder if there was a big fish among the refugees. But in any case, the enemy's tactical intention was very obvious. This intention was very strong. They wanted to break through the siege, they wanted to break through. The position where Ladios and Gulab's left flank disappeared formed a striking straight line on the map. It was more like a sharp sword that pierced the heart of the undead army. The half-zombie lord stared at the straight line and could not help but feel a chill in his heart. Mead stood up and threw the bone in his hand out. His eyes flashed as he stared at the dark forest, where his army was ready to go. But was his judgment right? Marcus was not sure this time. Who were they? Who was their commander? When did Erwin have such a commander? The night wind was like a pair of cold hands caressing the gorge. The rocks and valleys reflected a layer of cold light, and the trees rustled as if responding to the rustling sound of the waves on the mountain. The cavalry ran through the entire valley like a rushing river. The earth rumbled. Brando raised his sword and appeared in front of everyone. The light from the elven sword formed an undulating surface of light in the darkness like a silver flag, and to the others, the flag was the victory that the young man had brought them. The horsemen were already wholeheartedly in admiration. If they were to believe in a legend one day, it would definitely be that a king was truly invincible. Some of them were even veterans from the end of the November War. Some had experienced the Battle of Flower Moon, and some had experienced the defeat at Karsuk Highlands. However, Erwin had disappointed them time and time again. It was as if the country had sunk, and the will of the past had been buried under history. Under the dust, the glory of the past no longer belonged to them. Therefore, they fought for money and became mercenaries. Their fate was to chase after bounties and treasures. They had already abandoned the honor and faith of a warrior. But there wasn't a soldier who didn't desire victory. Even if he was a veteran who had experienced countless wars, it was still the same. Today, Brando let them pick up the flags that had been trampled thousands of times from the ground. He told them that they could still achieve a glorious victory. Even if they were like a knight, just fighting for the right of others to live, just fighting for the right of their own survival, as long as they followed behind him, victory would be so easy. It made their blood boil. They moved forward, and Sasser's squadron collapsed. They moved forward, and Gulab's squadron collapsed. They moved forward, and Ladios's left wing disappeared. They moved forward, and Gulab's army vanished into thin air. What was Madara's army? The undead who didn't know fear were also so vulnerable. That terrible army even made Erwin's regular army tremble in front of them, but they also turned and scattered in front of them. For a moment, the knight even believed that his name was invincible. Brando pointed his sword forward. The cavalry immediately cheered and formed a black torrent that rolled forward. It was as if no one knew fatigue, even the horses. Even the self-defense regiment behind them was completely motivated. They only had one thought left, and that was to keep moving forward. Accelerate, keep accelerating. No one had the spare energy to think about anything else. All their energy seemed to be used to stimulate adrenaline. Their pupils were dilated, and they breathed with exhaustion. It was as if they were using the last of their lives to pounce on any enemy that might appear and drag it to hell with them. What Madara? To hell with it. Even if their men and horses were exhausted, these soldiers would at least obtain the final victory. They raised their heads and seemed to be able to see the young man's sword pointing forward, leading them to an open door. Behind that door was a miracle. Brando finally saw another undead army in front of him. He believed that he had broken into the second and third layers of defense. Did that mean that he had entered the area controlled by Ebden or Wisa? Or Tamagat Marcus? He saw a group of white skeletons on the riverbank. There were so many of them, much more than what he had encountered before. Brando narrowed his eyes slightly and saw that there were at least 2 groups of black warriors beside the enemy commander. Column commander. Brando knew that he had caught a big fish this time, but whether or not he could eat it was still a problem. However, Brando knew that he had to eat it, and he had to eat it. At this moment, he could not retreat, and there was no way to retreat. He only had one thought left. When enemies meet on a narrow path, the brave will win. He raised his sword, and the elven sword's tip was so bright that it was blinding. The sound of the wind surrounded his ears, and there was only the sound of the wind. He could not hear anything else, and he could only shout with all his might. Cavalry, attack with me! Attack! There were only 49 people, but their response was like a tsunami. When the rumbling of the horses' hooves echoed throughout the valley, it was as if the heavens and earth were working together, and everyone had become one. The White Knight, Ebden's expression changed in an instant. Like Marcus, it had been guessing who the human commander was, and which order the mysterious army belonged to under Erwin. However, it did not expect that it would encounter the human commander under such circumstances. When it turned its head, a pair of burning eyes looked through the white embroidered helmet and saw the charging cavalry. It almost thought that it had returned to the era when the knight's spirit shone brightly. The White Knight seemed to have lost its mind for a moment. It remembered that many years ago, on the Golden Flower Plateau, the pride of the humans, the Cruz Empire's cavalry, were just as prideful. Those prideful knights did not even bother to use tactics. They only needed to charge, and charge again, and continuously charge, and they would be able to obtain victory. Because in this world, there was no other army that was as prideful and honorable as them. It was as if every single one of them would die in the midst of their charge. Their lives were all for that moment of burning, the dazzling brilliance. In front of an army that treated death as the highest honor, all combat power was useless. All resistance was useless and meaningless. Ebden felt that its soul had loosened up a little, and it almost thought that it had returned to 100 years ago. Its loss of mind caused it to miss the best time to react. When Ebden realized that it should have ordered its skeletons to turn around, it was already too late. Brando held the elven sword in his hand, and he was like the spearhead of this army. A silver line led all the Night Kings forward. Yes, in his eyes, the skeletons were slowly turning around, but they were too late. Too slow, too slow. Lich! Ebden unsheathed his sword and screamed from his soul. The 10 liches raised their bone staffs at the same time. A dark storm suddenly appeared in front of the undead army. When the storm formed, the ground shattered, and sharp rocks flew up and turned into dust. The branches on both sides turned into black smoke and rose into the sky. The White Knight Ebden could not help but hold its breath. It was not sure if what it saw was an illusion, but how could the current Erewhon see such a cavalry? But then, the pale knight remembered that it had stopped breathing a long time ago. It sighed. But in the next moment, the blazing frost-colored flames in its eye sockets froze in an instant. It could not help but open its mouth slightly as it looked at the young man who raised his right hand and charged out of the dark storm. He raised his hand, and a transparent blue magic circle flashed. Although the dark storm made of negative energy blew his hair back, he raised his hand and the storm immediately changed direction. He moved forward, and the storm also moved forward. Just like at that moment, Brando was the king who controlled the storm. When he struggled to shout, one word at a time, energy loss, the storm suddenly changed direction. The skeleton soldiers in the front row fell down row by row. The skeletons in the back tried to raise their spears, but they were hit by their comrades and fell down row by row. But Brando was also an arrow at the end of its flight. But in the next moment, they saw the young man's horse fall. Not only these undead creatures, but everyone on the battlefield saw Brando fall from the horse. At that moment, it was as if the entire valley was silent. The human refugees could not help but stare at the back and stop what they were doing. Freya tightened the reins and urged the self-defense team to speed up, but when she turned around, she saw this scene. She could not help but cover her mouth and could not make a sound. Romaine's expression finally changed, and she could not help but run forward while holding her skirt. Reto, Mano, Badam, Subduing Dragon, and Gisal could not help but let go of the reins in their hands. They just realized that even the young man could fall. But Brando had already adjusted his posture the moment he fell from the horse. He was just waiting for an opportunity. Charge, activate. As soon as his feet touched the ground, he spun half a circle in the air and shot out like an arrow leaving the bow. He moved forward, his sword forward, and a silver line appeared. Everyone saw the eye-catching silver line. It symbolized a miracle. After the silver line passed, the 12 skeleton soldiers were split in half. Brando landed in the middle of countless undead creatures and raised his sword high. He saw the tall undead knight covered in white. He also saw the burning frost flames in the other party's eyes. "So it's you, the White Knight, Ebden, the former hero of Erewhon." Brando looked at the other party, the elven sword slightly tilted, and the glowing blade was already pressed forward. "Your path ends here, young man." Ebden looked at him and blocked Brando's sword with his sword. Silver ranked. Brendel made use of the force to retreat. This was a bit difficult. He could not help but think, P.S. Double the last day's monthly votes. Chapter 87. Young man, this is the end of your journey. Ebden held a sword in one hand. The sword in his hand was called the Pale Fang. Even though it was just a normal magic sword, it was a testament to the achievements and glory of this knight. Ebden pressed his left hand on his right wrist. As soon as he finished speaking, a layer of white flame ignited on the thin blade. Brando knew that this was the sword skill that made him famous, white flame. Compared to him, Ebden was a true royal knight. He became a knight when he was 17 and a blacksmith when he was 40. He fought for Erwin his whole life and was a hero of Erwin until his death. However, the White Knight, Ebden only became famous after he became an undead. In his era, Ebden was one of the 4 horsemen of Madara's apocalypse, and his title as the White Knight came from that, the Conqueror Ebden. This title was not only able to stop children from crying. Brendel took a step back and immediately felt that the situation was troublesome. There were 2 captains in Tarku's camp that he didn't want to meet. One was the White Knight, Ebden the Conqueror, and the other was the Red Knight, Ladios the Conqueror. But it seemed like Lady Martha had played a little joke on him. But the White Knight's attack was too fast. Before he could finish his thoughts, Ebden had already slashed down with his sword. It was like a bright silver crescent of flame that came from the top. Before the sword even reached him, he could already feel the bone-chilling aura. He immediately felt suffocated and did not dare to be careless, so he quickly rolled to the side to avoid it. The flame blew across the ground, and with a bang, the rock was broken. The cut was covered in white frost. Just the wind pressure alone was enough to shatter rocks. This is the power of the lowest silver tier. Even if I use my White Raven swordsmanship, I can only cut through wood. Brendel thought to himself. This is the power of the lowest silver tier. My White Raven swordsmanship is only able to cut through wood. But when he rolled to the side, the White Knight, Ebden had already pulled the reins of his nightmare warhorse and charged forward. The undead knight didn't care about his subordinates at all. He stepped on a pile of bones and leapt to Brando's side. A pile of bones flew into the air. Then, the White Knight raised his sword and used the momentum of the horse to slash at the young man. Brando couldn't dodge and could only raise the Thorn of Light to block. The 2 swords collided with each other and bent backwards at the same time. Brendel felt as if his arm was about to break, and he was sent flying backwards like a cannonball. He rolled a few times on the ground before he managed to get up. The strength of at least 25 ounces, Brando supported himself with one hand on the ground. He was glad that he used the explosive strength skill at the last moment, or else his arm would have been crippled. But even so, he still felt numbness in his right hand. At first, he thought he had lost all feeling in his right hand. But it was too terrifying. The strength of a silver swordsman at the 2nd level was more than 7 tons. It was almost to the point where he could turn wind into a blade without any technique. Brando looked at the approaching White Knight and couldn't help but miss his holy sword card. It seemed like he could only rely on that kind of strength to defeat such a monster. But at this moment, he didn't have any earth EP that could be used to pay for it. Ebden and his horse were already in front of him. Brando gritted his teeth and raised his sword again. This time, he held the sword with both hands above his head. The tip of the sword was slightly slanted towards the ground. He assumed a military swordsmanship stance that was best at deflecting force. Mixed but not skilled. The White Knight looked down at him. A cold and hoarse voice came from under the helmet. It raised its sword and slashed down. Brando used the edge of his sword to clash with the pale Fong. At that moment, he adjusted the angle of the elven sword bit by bit. Sparks flew, and he actually allowed Ebden's sword to slide by his sword momentum. But the remaining force caused him to fall backward. Brando immediately kicked the ground with his back foot. It was as if the slight movement of adjusting the body's balance in the military swordsmanship had become an instinct. His whole body slid to the side, but he still firmly squatted on the ground. It took him a lot of effort to parry the sword, and he was already sweating profusely. In the game, he often did this kind of action, but it was always because the system helped him to plan the path, the sword, and the body's position. It would also help him adjust his actions, and not like this where he had to control every action himself. If he wasn't careful, he might even lose his life. But he actually did it. He swung his arm, but his right hand was still numb. His opponent's strength was too great. Every time they clashed, it was as if he was crashing into a heavy truck. Even after he deflected the force, he could still hear his muscles and bones groaning. Ebden also let out a muffled sound from under his helmet. It saw that this young man's swordsmanship was only average, but he seemed to be very experienced. He was able to find a suitable countermeasure in an instant. This was the reaction of a veteran. He turned his horse around and began to speed up again. But Brando finally broke away from his opponent's rhythm, so how could he let his opponent take the lead? He immediately raised his right hand and pointed the silver ring at Ebden and shouted, "Boss!" Magic activation incantation. The flames in the White Knight's eyes flickered. He immediately returned to his horse and placed his sword in front of him. Just as Ebden finished his action, a loud sound was heard, and a gust of wind rushed towards the undead knight, leaving a deep mark on the ground. But when the gust of wind hit the undead knight's sword, it immediately split into two and formed a beautiful, Y-shaped mark on the ground. Every skeleton soldier in this mark was instantly thrown high into the air and disintegrated into pieces before landing on the riverbank. Then, there was a series of crackling sounds, as if there was a rain of bones. The White Knight Ebden retracted his sword, and before the dust settled, he raised his sword again. Then, there was a clear clang. Brando had already jumped out of the smoke and clashed with his sword in midair. There were no openings. Brando was not surprised at all. After all, an elite of this level was stronger than the Golden Demonic Tree. In fact, when he fought against the Golden Demonic Tree, he also relied on the Holy Sword card. Otherwise, it would be hard to tell who would win. But against the White Knight Ebden, he did not dare to rely on luck. Challenging someone of a higher level could only rely on preparation and full strength. He exchanged a sword strike with his opponent, and as his body fell backward, he turned his hand and sent a sword wind back at his opponent. Ebden retracted his sword and swung it again without any expression. A silver flame extinguished Brando's gust of wind. Ebden retracted his sword for the third time, but this time, he was not in a hurry to attack. Instead, he quietly looked at Brando from his horse. He looked at the young man as if he was recalling a story from long ago. In the story, there was the melodious sound of a flute in the highlands, the swallow-tailed flag fluttering in the wind on the highlands of Balta. White Raven sword style. He spoke with a hoarse voice like a visitor from hell. "You're a member of the new generation of the royal family?" Ebden asked coldly. Brando was startled. Could it be that Ebden and the Corvado dynasty were old friends? But that's not right. I've never heard of such a thing in the game. But I don't care if it's true or not, I'll just deny it first. Otherwise, if the other party really has a grudge against me and suddenly goes berserk, it won't be fun anymore. Legend has it that there are level 30 bosses in the game that turn into level 40 elites. A level 40 elite would be able to kill them all in one hit. Thinking until here, he quickly shook his head. But what he did not expect was that Ebden slanted his sword and replied coldly, "If you're not, then I won't break the oath if I kill you." When Brando heard that, he almost vomited blood. He regretted it so much that his intestines turned green. If he knew there was such a stupid oath, he would have just taken the identity of a member of the new generation of the royal family. Of course, that was just a thought. Brendel knew that it was not easy to pretend to be a member of the royal family. After all, Corvado's royal family had the blood of the Mist Elves, and the Mist Elves were said to be born with the silver bloodline. And Brando's blood was the symbol of a mortal. On the other hand, Ebden returned to its humanoid state. It brandished its sword and spurred the nightmare warhorse to accelerate once again. Brendel did not know what to do in the face of such a murderous god. He thought of a way to stall for time, and that was to use the White Raven sword style under the effect of Power Burst. But it cost 9 points of stamina. Even if he was level 27 or 37, he would not be able to withstand it, let alone level 17. In fact, he was already feeling a little tired. On the other hand, Ebden was an elite that was at least level 30. According to his estimation, he had at least 200 HP. The 30 HP that the wind bullet dealt to him was nothing more than a scratch, and it was only a small impact. Brando was confident that he could kill Ebden with 2 or 3 stabs, but he had to be able to do it first. Thinking until here, he couldn't help but take a deep breath and look into the distance. He hoped that Reto and the others would come to his aid. But he saw that the cavalry had just clashed with the skeleton soldiers. Perhaps it was because of the advantage he created, but it was unlikely that they would be able to free themselves in such a short time. He could only hope that the self-defense forces would be able to catch up faster. In fact, Freya, who was leading the self-defense forces, had the same thought. The future Valkyrie turned around to look at the citizens of Fortress Reden who were stumbling as they ran. She couldn't help but frown, but she knew that they were just ordinary soldiers, and it was already thanks to their high morale that they were able to do this. She couldn't ask for more from them. But Freya raised her head and looked at the chaotic front. Although she couldn't see where Brando was, she knew that the commander of such a large undead army must be someone powerful. She was no longer the village girl from a few days ago. She gradually gained her own knowledge and experience. Unlike the others who blindly trusted the young man, she knew that Brando was in a tough battle. She couldn't help but look around and her gaze fell on the Shire and Sue. "Sue, can you help me?" The girl was slightly surprised. "Help me lead the self-defense forces." "What?" "I want to help Brando," Freya replied. She then turned her horse around and said, "The Shire, come with me." "Miss Freya, I'm fine. But are you sure it's okay?" The Shire was taken aback. Brando had instructed him to look after the injured Freya. But compared to that, he was indeed more worried about the safety of the person he followed. Freya looked at him and nodded vigorously. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 88. Brando raised his sword to block, and a gust of wind exploded from the point of contact between the elven sword and Ashen Fang, causing his hair to fly backwards. He squinted his eyes and used the force to slide backwards. He felt like half of his body was about to be torn apart. Although he hadn't been hit by a single sword due to his EXP, his HP had already dropped by more than 30 points on his retina. Brando knew that this was because his internal organs were damaged, and he was unable to completely disperse the force. This was also because his vitality was close to 7 ounces, so it was much tougher than normal people. If it was someone else, they would have died from the shock of the sword. But what made him feel bitter was that Abdon seemed to know this as well. His sword followed closely behind and did not give him a chance to breathe. There were a few times when Brando thought that Abdon did not care about his army at all. Although his army was on the verge of collapsing, the rows of skeleton soldiers in the valley were also on the verge of collapsing. Could it be that in this fellow's eyes, he alone was stronger than an entire army? Brando did not know that his ridiculous thought was the closest to reality. Even though the White Knight, Abdon was a hero of Aween when he was alive, but after he awakened as an undead, everything he did before his death was just a note. In Vaunt, the undead were an existence that twisted the laws of nature. In many of the teachings of the Holy Church, they were considered a blasphemy to the living because they were just another type of power, another type of thought that was controlling a body that was supposed to rot and return to the earth. It was a person, not a human. To the undead, its memories were just fragments of memories. There was a saying that the undead were not without fear because their greatest fear came from their memories when they were alive. Some undead would even fall into their memories and never be able to extricate themselves. To them, this was something that was even more difficult to resist than dying. Almost all of the undead avoided remembering because when they did, they would inevitably fall into fear. But perhaps the White Knight Abdon was a special individual among them. This knight would often be immersed in memories of the past. It remembered the knight's battle on the Golden Flower Plateau, as if it was watching everything from another person's point of view. The killing in its memory made it calmer and more ruthless. Therefore, at this moment, the White Knight, a high-ranking general of Madara, was thinking about how to kill the potential enemies of the Dark Kingdom in the cradle. Obviously, in its opinion, the threat of a potential and excellent commander was far greater than that of the motley crew. It was even willing to give up the victory of this battle to kill this young man. However, Brando's performance far exceeded the undead knight's expectations. He was well aware of Erwin's school of swordsmanship. Brando was obviously learning the most basic type of swordsmanship in the army, perhaps with some superficial knowledge of the court swordsmanship mixed in. But overall, he could only be considered an amateur. But it was this amateur level that caused him to return empty-handed time and time again. In the end, the undead knight could only choose to use its absolute strength to slowly grind its opponent to death. This method of fighting was a little shameless. For Abdon, who was a noble knight in both life and death, it was a little hard to accept. But for the sake of the 3 black scepters and the oath under the Black Code, it coldly chose to give up its honor. Abdon knew that many people would make the same choice as it. Madara had to make this choice. Martha above, Madara will always be under your protection. The flames in the undead knight's eyes were as cold as ice, and the long sword in his hand was already swinging down mercilessly. But as soon as he made his move, Brando had already dodged to the side as if he expected this. The undead knight's pale fang could only brush past the young man's body every time. Occasionally, when he guessed correctly, the young man would cleverly use his shallow swordsmanship to deflect the force. All of this was unbelievable to Abdon. It's the same again. The soul fire in Abdon's eye sockets flickered. From the start, it had already switched to 3 different swordsmanship. At first, it used the Erwin swordsmanship that it was most familiar with. Then, it switched to the Erwin royal swordsmanship, but Brando guessed all of them correctly. At first, it thought Brando was very familiar with the swordsmanship of its own country, so it subconsciously switched to Madara's Dark Cross swordsmanship. But it didn't expect that not only did Brando not feel uncomfortable, but his guesses were even more accurate. If the undead had emotions, the White Knight Abdon would probably be cursing right now. But what it didn't know was that Brando's familiarity with the Erwin royal swordsmanship was limited to the level 30 in the original game. In his long experience, he had seen hundreds of high-level and common swordsmanship. But if there was one swordsmanship that he was most familiar with, it must be the Church's Knight swordsmanship and Madara's Dark Cross swordsmanship. There was no other reason other than practice makes perfect. The knight swordsmanship was the swordsmanship that Brando used the longest in his previous life, and the dark cross swordsmanship was the swordsmanship that he saw the most. Brando had fought with Madara in the game for 70 to 80 years, so his understanding of the royal swordsmanship was as natural as drinking water. But that didn't mean that Brando was having an easy time. Because under Ebden's absolute suppression, he couldn't even find a chance to counterattack. No matter how old the swordsmanship was, it couldn't withstand the agility of 16 ounces. Sometimes, Brando couldn't even catch Ebden's hand movements and could only guess based on his experience. And Brando soon felt that his stamina was approaching the danger line. If a person's stamina dropped below half, their strength and reflexes would start to weaken. If it dropped below 1/3, it would be hard for a person to maintain their form. However, it had only been 3 minutes since the start of the battle. Brando was sweating profusely. Facing Ebden's relentless attacks, he gradually lost the ability to think. At first, he could still find the time to observe the situation on the battlefield, but as his stamina slowly decreased, he had to use close to his full strength every time he dodged Ebden's sword. The exchange of swords became more frequent. It was like a vicious cycle. The more he exchanged swords with Ebden, the more he felt powerless. But the more powerless he was, the harder it was for him to dodge Ebden's sword. Brendel gritted his teeth and persevered. This kind of perseverance had almost nothing to do with death. Compared to squeezing out the potential from his sore bones time and time again, escaping from death time after time, the exhaustion that gushed out from the depths of his soul made him feel like he was about to fall asleep forever in the next moment. It made him want to give up completely. But this time, he suddenly thought of Freya and the little Roman. He thought of the cavalrymen who fought with him. The feeling of blood boiling from his chest made him persevere. He knew that this was a kind of responsibility. It made him responsible for everything he did and said. There was a moment when he closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the first thing he saw was a field of snow. Brando finally woke up. His scalp was numb. He rolled on the ground in a posture that had nothing to do with elegance. But at this moment, Ebden's power finally exploded. With a thrust of the sword, the power of the lowest silver moved forth a silver flame that spread over the hills and fields before it. It was like a silver moon. It moved forward, noiselessly, and the rocks crumbled, and the fir trees fell back, one by one. From the valley to the top, the sword had actually carved out a cone-shaped barren hillside that was close to 150 feet in diameter. The cold wind blew, and the valley was silent. There was a moment of silence. Everyone was shocked. Although they had heard of the second level of power, the power of the silver tier, they had never seen it with their own eyes. At this moment, they witnessed a miracle that almost no human could achieve. Everyone couldn't help but revere the power that came from the bottom of their hearts. This kind of revere wasn't fear or despair. It was purely the worship of a small mortal towards a great power. Even Reto, Mano, and the others froze. They couldn't believe that Brando was fighting with such a monster. But they wasted time and didn't help the young man in time. Brando didn't say anything. However, these mercenaries felt a deep sense of shame in their hearts. At this moment, they could feel the heavy sense of responsibility from the young man. It turned out that the seemingly relaxed young man had been seriously fulfilling his promise to each of them. If it was said that they worshipped Brando blindly in the past, then this was the first time they felt a sense of belonging. But where was Brando? They couldn't help but worry. Would he be able to survive such an attack? The White Knight, Ebden, withdrew his sword and let out a clear cry. Brando! Freya was riding her horse to the place where Brendel and Ebden were fighting, but she was a step too late when she saw the fight between the youth and Ebden. It was as if everything had ended. The sword in Freya's hand fell to the ground with a clang. She couldn't believe what she saw. The young man who brought her out of Buchi, the young man who showed her the world outside the well, that shameless bastard. This is as far as I can go. But she felt someone patting her shoulder. The future goddess of war couldn't help but turn around in a daze. She saw the Shire. The young wizard stared at the bottom of the hill without moving his eyes. Miss Freya, as long as I'm still here, it means that the Lord is still alive. W.H. What? The ponytailed girl was stunned. She couldn't understand the meaning behind the Shire's words. But at least she understood a part of it. Because she immediately saw a familiar figure crawling out from under a pile of rocks. Brando felt as if his whole body was about to fall apart. His clothes were completely torn, his forehead was covered in blood, and there were countless wounds on his body. However, he still endured the pain and chuckled with incomparable pride. Old man, I didn't expect you to miss this at the end. P.S. Good evening everyone. That's all. Good night. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support legal reading. Chapter 89. Ebden raised its head and was slightly startled. Brando took advantage of its shock and jumped up from the rubble. His body was like a shadow that grew taller and taller, leaving behind a series of afterimages. It was as if he had crossed a dozen meters in an instant. Ebden immediately realized that it was impossible to track his movements. Brando had the agility of 44 ounces after activating charge. He was like the wind or a gust of wind. When the undead knight turned around, Brando was already behind it. Ebden had already guessed that this was a terrifying burst of speed technique. In fact, it had already seen it at the start of the battle. But now that it was experiencing it personally, it was different. This young man was not simple. The White Knight's pale fang was unsheathed in an instant. It instinctively blocked Brando's elven sword with a clang. This strike was beyond the realm of swordsmanship. Both sides were fighting with their experience. But Brando had already turned around after his strike missed. He still had one more second. He was like a phantom that avoided Ebden's sight and stabbed his sword towards the left side of the knight's chest. Ebden immediately swung its sword back to block Brando's attack. There was not a single flaw. How troublesome. Brendel gritted his teeth as he was covered in wounds. But this time, it was the undead knight's expression that changed. It suddenly felt that Brando had split into two, one from the left and one from the right. What was this? Projection technique. Dual martial arts. Ebden sensed the threat behind him and immediately turned around. However, he immediately saw a gargoyle being split in half by his sword and rolling far away. That moment was like a slow-motion scene. In the burning soul fire in its eyes, the scattered gargoyles slowly disintegrated and collapsed in the air. However, the undead knight immediately felt that something was wrong. Brando had already swung his sword from the other side. This was the last strike of his charge mode, power burst, White Raven sword style. But at that moment, the White Knight Ebden lowered his sword, and the Nightmare Warhorse's hooves caved in, and it died in an instant. Then a huge force pushed Brendel and his sword out of the air, not allowing him to resist at all. Wall of Will. Although Brando knew that Ebden was a high-ranked knight, it must have learned the Sun Knight Egwensen's aura tactic. He was still hoping for a fluke. But Ebden's reaction pushed him to the bottom of the abyss. However, this was an opportunity that couldn't be missed. Steeling his heart, he retreated 7 or 8 steps before coming to a stop. Gritting his teeth, he charged forward. The White Knight Ebden stood up from the ground, but this gap was enough for it to counterattack. It threw its pure white cloak to the back and charged forward with its pale fang. Bang! 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 It clashed with Brando 3 times. Each strike made Brando stagger backward. The young man felt a sharp pain in his chest and almost coughed out blood. At that moment, Redo and Mano finally broke free from the entanglement of the skeleton soldiers. They saw what happened and immediately turned their horses around. Erwin. Ebden looked coldly at Brando's broken defense and raised its sword for the last time. The pale flames in its eyes were as cold as ice. "You're too old." It thrust its sword forward. He let go of the elven sword in his left hand and raised it up to block Ebden's ashen fangs. Then he pressed down on it again. The leather gloves released a circle of blue light, but it was pierced in an instant. The smile on Brendel's face disappeared, and he pursed his lips and pressed his sword down. The protective gloves on his hands were instantly set ablaze due to the overload of mana. But the sword still pressed down and left a bloody wound on his palm. Then, it bit open the chain armor on his body. The broken metal ring fell down like a smooth piece of wood. The snake-like sword drilled into the young man's lower abdomen. The blood was as glaring as an aged red wine. But Ebden didn't see victory at this moment. What it saw was Brendel using his bloody left hand to hold his right hand that was only left with bones. Slowly, but forcefully, he kept the pale fang in its piercing position. Then, he raised the elven sword in his right hand. In the eyes of the undead knight, there was also a sword burning with pure silver sacred flames. The sword is born from the light, the courage of all enemies. There were elven words engraved on the sword. Then, the sword moved forward. Ebden raised its left hand to block, but the pure fire on the sword instantly burned through its bony palm and came out from the other side, stabbing into its chest. The two swords connected the two knights together. At that moment, there was only the sound of the cold wind blowing through the valley. Brando said weakly, "Old man, you missed out on one thing. You think you won, young man?" Ebden said coldly. Its voice was hoarse and low as if it came from another world. It felt as if its chest was on fire. The pain was like torture, but Ebden knew that it was not a fatal wound for it. Of course, it would need a long period of rest after this battle. "No, it's just, Erwin is old, but there are still people who love it." Brando couldn't help but sigh. The White Knight was waiting for this opportunity. The two drew their swords at the same time and attacked at the same time. The young man leaned to the left and let Ebden's sword bite into his right lung. But at the same time, he raised his elven sword up high and caused the undead knight's left arm to fly far away. The two retreated at the same time. Brando immediately knelt on the ground and coughed loudly. He felt like his lungs were on fire. He had never experienced this in the game before, but he had experienced it once in Butchie. The unyielding talent had been activated. He endured the waves of pain and stood up using his sword to support himself. But Ebden had already stood up. Its injuries were much lighter than Brando's. Although it was impressed by the young man's tenacity and unyielding confidence, but at this moment, the undead knight needed victory more. It was unable to maintain its balance after losing its left arm, but compared to Brando, who immediately knelt down after standing up, it was much better. Ebden glanced to the left. Redo and Mano were still a step away from entering the battlefield. Thus, it quickly raised its pale fang and rushed towards Brando again. But this time, it suddenly saw a flash of golden light at the top of the mountain. It wasn't an illusion. Almost everyone who raised their heads to look at this side saw the golden red, blinding light. One of its ends shot out from Freya's ring, while the other pierced towards the White Knight, Ebden. However, that wasn't the case for Ebden. What it saw wasn't a straight line, but a rolling fireball instead. Because it was too fast, the afterimage left behind in the night gave the illusion that it was just a golden red line. Flame. Then, Freya's loud voice echoed in the valley. Ebden immediately raised its sword, but it was still too late. The flame hit the tip of its sword and instantly expanded into a fireball. The shockwave spread out from the flame. At first, it was a visible shockwave that spread across the entire valley. Everyone's hair flew backwards, the trees' ABs fell, and the needles flew into the night sky. Then, countless gravel brushed past the hooves of Leto and Mano's horses, startling them so much that they stood up high. But the flashing fireball only existed for a moment in everyone's eyes. Then, all the light sources dimmed. It was as if the entire night had become darker. Everyone couldn't help but turn around. They couldn't even see their own fingers. Only Brando, who was blown away by the shockwave, could see the white knight, Ebden, who was half kneeling behind the smoke. The undead knight was motionless. Brendel knew that he would not be able to stand up no matter how strong he was. First, he was hit by a wind bullet that dealt 30 damage, then he was hit by 2 swords that dealt at least 140 damage, and then he was hit by a fireball that dealt 45 damage. He couldn't help but touch his forehead. He couldn't believe that he won just like that. But Freya's fireball almost blasted him half to death. Fortunately, he had the legendary innate skill, Unyielding. Brando couldn't help but laugh. He said that Ebden had miscalculated because he knew that Ebden wouldn't know that he had such a big secret. He looked at Ebden and didn't know what the former hero of Erewhon was thinking. Was it thinking that it would be defeated just like that? Or was he reminiscing about his past glory? Brando thought for a while and coughed. He wanted to sit up, but he heard a rustling sound behind him. He turned around and saw Freya and the Shire sliding down the hill nervously. Brando! The ponytailed girl saw the young man lying on the ground, and all her thoughts were thrown out of her head. She only had one thought in her mind, and that was to rush up to him and support him. She asked carefully, Brendel, are you all right? Brando wanted to answer, but his heart skipped a beat and he lay back down. Freya, is that you? He suddenly coughed and asked weakly while lying on the ground. Yes, it's me. Can't you see me? Freya saw that Brando was covered in wounds, especially the wounds on his chest and lower abdomen. She didn't know what to do and looked like she was about to cry. Brando, don't say anything. I'll bandage your wounds. Freya, there's no need. I need your help with something. What is it? Freya could not help but panic when she heard his words, and her heart tensed up subconsciously. Let me think. Why don't you kiss me first? Freya still had tears in her eyes, but when she heard this strange request, she couldn't help but be startled. Seeing the ponytailed girl's serious face, Brando finally couldn't help but laugh. He hurriedly sat up and replied, I'm just kidding, Freya. I'm asking you to help me stand up. Your wounds, Brando, don't move. Don't be like this. I'll kiss you. Freya was confused and thought that Brando was angry with her. She couldn't help but lower her head and blush. Brando was startled and realized that he had gone overboard. He hurriedly explained, Freya, I'm really fine. How is that possible? I'm not just a knight. I'm also a magus, you know. Brando didn't expect that Freya didn't believe him at all. He could only use another method to deceive her. Are you really fine? Of course. Brando gritted his teeth as if to show that he was really fine. He put on a pose of I'm very healthy while enduring the pain. Then, he reached for the number 9 holy water in his backpack with cold sweat all over his forehead. But Freya stared at him in a daze. Her face first turned from red to white, and then back to red. Then, she bit her lips, lowered her head, and slowly clenched her fists. Brando, you shameless bastard. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian. Come and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.